The stones of Troy lie under a hard Aegean sun, half buried in dust, grass, and the long silence that follows every ruined city. From a distance, the mound does not look like the heart of one of the most famous wars ever told. It rises gently above the plain near the entrance to the Dardanelles, a layered hill of broken walls, burned mud brick, collapsed towers, and human memory. Wind moves over the ruins where people once walked behind gates, carried jars of grain, sharpened bronze blades, whispered over family hearths, and watched the horizon for sails. Somewhere in this earth, if the old stories are not entirely dreams, there was once a city wealthy enough to attract enemies, strong enough to resist them, and unlucky enough to become immortal only after it was destroyed. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War begins here, not with a single answer, but with a strange collision between legend and archaeology. For thousands of years, the war is remembered through poetry warriors shining in bronze, kings arguing over honour, a woman whose beauty brings ships across the sea, a wooden horse waiting in the dark, and a city burning while its people realise too late that the danger has already entered the walls. Yet beneath the poetry is something rougher, older, and more difficult to grasp. The ground itself contains layers of settlement, destruction, rebuilding, and abandonment. Troy is not one city, but many cities stacked upon one another, each rising over the remains of the last. The legend points toward one great catastrophe, but the archaeology reveals a long and complicated life. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not only about heroes and gods, but about trade, power, memory, ruined walls, and the way real human conflicts can survive as myth long after the world that produced them has vanished. The first surprise is that Troy was not invented by poets out of empty air. The place exists. Its ruins stand in northwestern Turkey, near a narrow waterway that connects the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and, beyond that, to the Black Sea, in the Bronze Age. This region matters. Ships moving between worlds must pass near it. People, goods, metals, grain, timber, horses, amber, textiles, and stories travel along these routes. A city controlling or influencing movement near this crossing could become rich, watched, and resented. What survives in the record suggests that Troy was not simply a lonely fortress at the edge of the world. It belonged to a crowded and competitive landscape where kingdoms, palace states, merchants, raiders, and imperial powers all had reasons to look toward the same waters. Still, the evidence remains incomplete. Archaeology does not uncover Homer's verses lying neatly in the dust. It gives fragments, pottery, bones, walls, ceilings, burned floors, arrowheads, storage jars, imported objects, and traces of rebuilding. These traces must be dated, compared, interpreted, and argued over. Scholars still debate which layer of Troy, if any, best matches the city remembered in the epic tradition. Some layers are too early, others are too small, too damaged, or too difficult to connect with a specific war. The most discussed candidates are late Bronze Age levels, especially Troy 6 and Troy 7a, because they show a city of real importance, with strong walls and signs of destruction or crisis. But no inscription has been found at the site that says, plainly, "This is the Troy of Priam, this is where Achilles fought, this is where the Greeks came ashore." History rarely leaves answers that generous. The legend, however, refuses to disappear. It lingers because it feels larger than a local war. In the famous tradition, the Trojan War begins with a wound to honour and ends with the destruction of a city. Greek kings gather under one cause. Troy stands behind its walls. Years pass. Heroes die. The conflict becomes a story about pride, rage, loyalty, fate, and the cost of glory. But when the divine machinery of the myth is set aside, something historically plausible remains beneath it. A coalition of Western powers attacking a wealthy city in Western Anatolia during a period when the entire Eastern Mediterranean world is under strain. That possibility does not prove the Iliad is a straightforward historical record. It does suggest that the poem may preserve, in altered form, memories of a real age of violence. The ruins themselves complicate the matter further. Early excavators believed they had found the city of the Trojan War and, in their eagerness, damaged parts of the mound that later archaeologists would have studied more carefully. Heinrich Schliemann, the 19th century excavator most associated with Troy, cut through the site with dramatic ambition and imperfect methods. He found treasures, walls, and ancient layers, but he also misidentified what he had uncovered. The glittering objects he famously linked to Priam were far older than the traditional date of the Trojan War. This is one of the great ironies of the search for Troy. The desire to prove the legend sometimes obscured the evidence that might have explained it. Later archaeologists brought more careful techniques, and the picture became less romantic but more fascinating. Troy was not a single heroic stage set. It was a living settlement with centuries of change behind it. The landscape around the city has also changed. The coastline of the Bronze Age was not exactly the coastline seen today. Rivers have shifted sediment, plains have grown, harbours may have silted up. A place that now seems inland may once have felt closer to maritime movement, more exposed to ships, traders, and enemies. This matters because ancient war is shaped by terrain, a fortress overlooking routes, near water, controlling access to inland Anatolia and seaborne exchange, is not merely a symbol, it is a practical asset. If Troy stood at a meeting point of worlds, then conflict around it needs no magical explanation. It needs only ambition, fear, trade, pride, and the fragile diplomacy of kings. The burned remains are especially powerful, but even fire does not speak with one voice. A destruction layer can mean invasion. It can also mean earthquake, accident, internal conflict, or a combination of disasters. Troy 6 appears to have suffered major damage, possibly from an earthquake, though scholars still debate the exact cause and implications. Troy 7a, often dated closer to the traditional horizon of the Trojan War, shows signs of crowding and stress, with storage vessels sunk into floors and buildings adapted in ways that may suggest a community under pressure. It too ends in destruction. These clues invite interpretation, but they resist certainty. No single explanation fully accounts for this evidence, and that is part of what makes the Trojan War so enduring. It sits precisely at the border between what can be excavated and what can only be remembered. The human reality behind that border is easy to forget. A city is not only walls and royal names, it is bakers, potters, herders, children, sailors, guards, servants, metal workers, and elders who know the old stories of the gates. If siege or destruction came, they would have experienced it not as epic destiny, but as shortage, smoke, fear, rumour, and waiting. Grain stores would matter more than glory. Wells would matter more than speeches. The sound of approaching enemies would not be poetic. It would be practical and terrifying. The hidden truth behind Troy may be that the famous war, if rooted in history, was not one shining duel between heroic civilizations, but a brutal event inside a network of political and economic pressures that ordinary people paid for with their homes. And yet, without the legend, the stones might never have drawn such attention. Without the stones, the legend might seem untethered from the earth. Together, they create one of history's most haunting puzzles. The Trojan War is neither fully proven in the way a modern battle can be documented, nor easily dismissed as pure invention. It belongs to a deeper category memory shaped by centuries of retelling, anchored to a real place, distorted by poetry, and illuminated only in flashes by archaeology. The city beneath the mound was real, The late Bronze Age world around it was real. The collapse that swept through that world was real. Whether the war of Achilles, Hector, Helen, Agamemnon, and Priam happened exactly as sung is another matter entirely. The search therefore begins not with the question of whether every famous scene is true, but with something more careful and more revealing. What kind of world could produce such a story? What pressures could send armies across the sea? What city could become important enough to be remembered for 3,000 years? What fragments of historical violence might survive inside a poem filled with gods, grief, and bronze? Beneath the legend is a buried city. Around the city is a vanished world. And inside that vanished world, somewhere between ash, song, and broken stone, the Trojan War begins to look less like a fantasy and more like a memory that has been transformed by time. Long before the name of Achilles becomes attached to rage, and long before Troy becomes a symbol of doomed beauty, the Eastern Mediterranean is already a world of restless movement. Ships cross between islands and coasts with cargoes that seem ordinary only until they are imagined in the hands of the people who depend on them. Copper ingots shaped like stretched hides, tin that must travel from distant sources before it can become bronze, jars of perfumed oil, folded textiles, ivory, grain, wine, timber, dyed cloth, and small luxury objects that carry the taste of faraway courts. The sea is not an empty blue space between civilizations. It is a road, a risk, and a living archive of ambition. Along its edges, palaces rise, scribes mark clay tablets, kings send gifts that are not quite gifts, and alliances are built with the same care as walls, because every ruler knows that wealth can arrive by ship, and danger can arrive the same way. This is the late Bronze Age, the world before the remembered Trojan War, and it is more connected than it first appears. In mainland Greece, powerful palace centres such as Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, and Thebes command territories through systems of storage, taxation, craft production, and redistribution. Across the Aegean, islands serve as stepping stones for traders, envoys, sailors, and raiders. Farther east, in Anatolia, the Hittite Empire controls vast regions from its heartland, managing vassal states, borderlands, rival powers, and difficult western territories that never sit entirely still. To the south and southeast lie Egypt, Cyprus, Syria, the Levant, and Mesopotamia, each part of a diplomatic and commercial world in which rulers know one another by reputation, exchange letters, marry daughters into foreign courts, and complain, with remarkable seriousness, when gifts are too small or messages too slow. The surprising thing about this age is not that war happens, it is that diplomacy exists on such a grand and delicate scale. The surviving records from major Bronze Age states show rulers addressing one another as brothers, even when that brotherhood is more performance than affection. Gold, lapis, horses, chariots, fine garments, and skilled workers move through elite networks. A king's prestige depends partly on the visible proof that other kings recognize him. Behind the ceremonial language, however, there is tension. The entire system rests on access to metals, access to ports, access to labour, access to routes, access to food. Bronze itself is a reminder of interdependence. Copper and tin are not always found together. A warrior's spear, a chariot fitting, a palace tool, a ceremonial blade, even the practical objects of daily administration, depend on supply chains that can stretch across dangerous distances. If those routes falter, the shine of power dulls very quickly. In this world, the Mycenaean Greeks are not yet the classical Greeks of later memory. They do not live in marble city-states with democratic assemblies and philosophers strolling through colonnades. Their society is older, more palace-centred, more martial, and in some ways more mysterious. Their scribes write in Linear B, an early form of Greek recorded on clay tablets, mostly for administration rather than literature. The tablets speak in inventory sheep, oil, bronze, wheels, grain, armour, personnel, offerings, allocations. They do not sing of heroes, they count, yet the counting is revealing. It shows a world where palaces organise production, where chariots and weapons are stored with bureaucratic care, where textiles and food move through official channels, and where power is measured not only by warriors, but by the ability to command households, fields, workshops, and storerooms. The Mycenaean palaces are fortified in a way that suggests confidence mixed with anxiety. Their massive walls, later called Cyclopean because later Greeks imagined only giants could have moved such stones, enclose royal centres on high ground. Inside are halls, courts, storage rooms, frescoes, workshops, and records. The ruling elite present themselves through feasting, burial wealth, weapons, imported goods, and monumental architecture, gold masks, decorated swords, amber beads, carved seals, and painted pottery speak of both local power and long-distance contact. The evidence remains incomplete, because the human stories behind those objects rarely survive in their own words. But what survives in the record suggests an aristocratic world obsessed with status, display, warfare, and controlled abundance. Across the water, Anatolia is no less complex. The Hittite Empire is a major power, capable of fielding armies, making treaties, installing vassal rulers, and recording disputes in writing. Its western frontier, however, is a zone of persistent difficulty. The Hittite texts refer to places and peoples whose exact locations are still debated, and among these names are two that have become central to the Trojan question, Wilusa and Ahiawa. Many scholars consider Wilusa a strong candidate for the region associated with Troy or Ilios, while Ahiawa is often connected, cautiously but seriously, with the Mycenaean Greek world. The linguistic and geographic arguments are intricate, and scholars still debate details, but the broad possibility is striking. Long before Homer's poems are written down, Hittite scribes may already be recording political trouble in the same Western Anatolian world, where later Greeks locate Troy. This does not mean the Hittite archives contain a simple version of the Iliad. They do not name Achilles or Hector, and they do not describe a 10-year siege caused by Helen. Instead, they reveal something less romantic and more historically useful. Western Anatolia is contested, unstable, and entangled with powers from across the sea. There are disputes involving local rulers, shifting loyalties, military pressure, and outside interference. A place like Troy, if identified with or near Wilusa, would sit within this world of negotiation and threat. The Trojan War, in historical terms, may not have been an isolated explosion caused by one dramatic insult. It may have belonged to a longer pattern of conflict along a frontier between Anatolian states and Aegean powers. The geography encourages this tension. The Aegean is filled with short crossings, islands, promontories, and harbours. It connects rather than separates. A ship leaving the Greek mainland can move through chains of islands toward the Anatolian coast, where trade and raiding may sometimes be difficult to distinguish. A diplomatic gift in one season can be followed by a raid in another. Warriors can serve as agents of kings, but also as opportunists. Coastal communities must negotiate with strangers who arrive from the sea bearing goods, requests, threats, or all three at once. The Bronze Age world is not neatly divided into peaceful merchants and formal armies. The same maritime skill that brings exchange can bring violence. No single explanation fully accounts for the patterns of contact, but the mixture of trade, prestige, and coercion is impossible to ignore. There is also a deeper fragility beneath the grandeur. Palace economies are powerful, but they are not indestructible. They depend on harvests, labour obligations, scribal administration, elite cooperation, military protection, and routes that remain open. A bad sequence of droughts, earthquakes, rebellions, invasions, piracy, or political breakdowns can do more than damage one city. It can disrupt the whole web, The Late Bronze Age often looks impressive from above, with its palaces, treaties, and luxury goods, but from within it may have felt like a system constantly adjusting to risk. Rulers build walls because rivals exist. They store grain because shortage is possible. They keep records because control requires memory. They cultivate alliances because isolation is dangerous. Troy stands at the edge of this world, but not outside it. Its later fame can make it seem like a mythic island, existing only for the purpose of being attacked. In reality, the settlement near the Dardanelles belongs to a region where cultures meet and overlap. Pottery styles, architectural forms, imported objects, and strategic geography all suggest a city aware of both Anatolian and Aegean spheres. It is neither purely Greek nor simply a passive Anatolian victim waiting for legend to arrive. It is part of a borderland, and borderlands are often where stories become complicated. They absorb languages, goods, loyalties, fears, and ambitions from multiple directions. They can become wealthy because they connect worlds, and vulnerable for the same reason. To understand the Trojan War, then, the mind has to move away from the image of a single romantic quarrel and toward a broader Bronze Age horizon. The war remembered in song may preserve echoes of a time when kingdoms watched sea lanes, when palaces competed for honour and resources, when Western Anatolia mattered to great powers, and when a fortified city near a strategic crossing could become the focus of violence. The gods of the later poems may belong to epic imagination, but the hunger for bronze, grain, tribute, status, and control belongs firmly to history. Before Achilles, before Helen, before the horse, there is this wide, interconnected world of ships and palaces, glittering on the surface and strained underneath. It is a world impressive enough to produce legends, and fragile enough to disappear. Troy's power begins with its position, because in the ancient world geography can behave almost like destiny. The city stands near the entrance to the Dardanelles, the narrow passage that leads from the Aegean toward the Sea of Marmara, and then onward to the Black Sea. Today, maps make this look simple, a thin blue line between land masses. But for Bronze Age sailors, the passage is a threshold between regions, winds, currents, markets, and dangers. A ship approaching from the Aegean does not merely pass by an anonymous coast. It comes near a landscape watched by settlements, guarded by hills, shaped by rivers, and controlled by people who understand that movement through narrow waters is never politically innocent. Whoever lives near such a place does not need to rule the whole sea to matter. It is enough to sit where others must slow down, wait, negotiate, trade, beach their vessels, seek shelter, or fear obstruction. The plain below Troy was not exactly the plain visible today. Over thousands of years, rivers have carried sediment, coastlines have shifted, and harbours have changed. The city that now feels somewhat inland may once have stood closer to navigable water and maritime activity. This is one of those details that quietly alters the imagination. Troy was not simply a high-walled inland stronghold waiting above a dusty battlefield. In the late Bronze Age, it likely belonged to a more fluid coastal environment, with access to shipping, wetlands, river mouths, and routes leading both inland and seaward. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the precise shape of the Bronze Age coastline and harbour zones. But the broader point is clear enough: Troy's landscape gave it access, visibility, and strategic value. That value did not have to come from a modern kind of empire. Troy may not have controlled every ship passing through the straits in a formal bureaucratic sense. It may not have collected tolls the way later states would. But influence in the Bronze Age could be subtler and still powerful. A city could offer anchorage, provisions, pilots, protection, storage, market access, and diplomatic contacts. It could also threaten delay, deny support, encourage raiders, or side with one power against another. For traders moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea regions, for rulers seeking allies along the Anatolian coast, for sailors hoping to survive difficult winds. Such a city could become both useful and dangerous. No single explanation fully accounts for Troy's importance, but its location gives the legend a hard, practical core. Archaeology shows that Troy was not a grand capital on the scale of Egypt's Thebes or the Hittite heartland. It was smaller than the imagination often makes it. Yet size can mislead. A fortified city at a strategic crossing may be more significant than its population alone suggests. The citadel at Troy, especially in the levels associated with the Late Bronze Age, had impressive walls, carefully built stone defences, towers, gates, and a commanding position. Later work has also suggested a lower settlement beyond the citadel, meaning the city may have been larger and more socially complex than early excavators believed. The exact scale is still debated, but the old image of Troy as a tiny hilltop fortress is no longer sufficient. What survives in the record suggests a place with enough organisation, wealth, and defensive concern to matter in its region. The walls themselves deserve attention because they are not only military structures, they are messages. A wall tells outsiders that the people within have resources worth protecting, labour enough to build, authority enough to command that labour, and enemies enough to justify the effort. Troy's sloping stone walls, with their carefully fitted masonry and strong gates, would have shaped every approach to the city. A traveller coming across the plain would see not just houses, but power made visible. In the Bronze Age, such architecture is never neutral. It marks hierarchy, it separates inside from outside, it creates a stage for negotiation, intimidation, and ceremony. At the gate, merchants may wait, envoys may enter, guards may inspect strangers, and refugees may beg to be admitted when the countryside becomes unsafe. Inside and around the city, life would have been layered with ordinary tasks that rarely survive in heroic poetry. People grind grain, store food, mend tools, herd animals, weave cloth, shape pottery, carry water, repair roofs, and preserve what they can against bad seasons. The wealth of Troy, if it existed in the form later memory suggests, was not only gold or treasure, it was stored food, controlled movement, skilled labour, livestock, textiles, metal goods, and relationships with other communities. A city becomes worth attacking when it stands at the intersection of material value and symbolic value. Troy may have possessed both. It could represent access to roots, but also prestige. To dominate such a city or to break it would send a message beyond its walls. The city's cultural identity is part of the mystery. Later Greek tradition makes Troy the great enemy of the Achaeans, a foreign city whose fall becomes a defining moment in Greek heroic memory. Yet the archaeological picture is not so clean. Troy belongs to northwestern Anatolia, and its material culture reflects local and regional traditions as well as contact across the Aegean. It likely stood within a world where Anatolian languages, customs, and political ties mattered deeply. At the same time, imported Mycenaean pottery and other signs of exchange show that it was not isolated from the Greek-speaking palace world. This mixture makes Troy more believable, not less. Real border cities are rarely simple. They survive by managing contact, and contact leaves traces. A lesser-known but important detail is that the winds and currents near the Dardanelles can make passage difficult. Ancient sailing is not a matter of pointing a ship and moving at will. Mariners depend on season, weather, current, local knowledge, and safe stopping points. A fleet may be delayed not only by enemy action but by the sea itself. In such conditions, coastal communities gain leverage. A city near a difficult passage can become a place where sailors wait, bargain, resupply, and listen for news. It can also become a place where resentment gathers. If outsiders believe a city is interfering with movement, favouring rivals, sheltering raiders, or profiting too greatly from strategic geography, conflict becomes easier to imagine. The surrounding region also connects inland routes with coastal exchange. Troy is not merely looking west toward the Aegean, it also belongs to Anatolia, with roads and relationships leading deeper into the land. This dual orientation may have made it valuable to larger powers. For the Hittites, Western Anatolia is a zone where local rulers can be loyal, rebellious, ambiguous, or dangerously influenced by powers from across the sea. For Mycenaean elites, the Anatolian coast is both opportunity and frontier. A city like Troy, standing near one of the great crossings, could become a diplomatic partner in one generation and a military problem in another. Scholars still debate how direct Mycenaean involvement in the region truly was, but the pattern of contact is too strong to ignore. The legend remembers Troy as wealthy, proud, and difficult to take. Those features may be poetic exaggerations, but they are not absurd. A city does not need to be the greatest power of its age to become the focus of a famous war. It only needs to stand where larger tensions converge. A local dispute can become a regional crisis if the city involved sits at a valuable crossing. A raid can become a remembered war if elite families and coalitions are drawn in. A destroyed stronghold can become a symbol if its fall happens during a period when many other centres are also under pressure. Troy's fame may come not from its size, but from its timing and position. This is why the city at the crossroads matters so deeply to the hidden truth of the Trojan War. The myth gives Troy beauty, nobility, and doom. Archaeology gives it walls, pottery, destruction layers, and geography. History gives it a place inside the turbulent Late Bronze Age, where maritime routes and palace ambitions create constant tension. None of these alone proves the war as told in epic tradition. Together, they make the story plausible in a deeper way. They show that Troy was not chosen at random by memory. It stood where ships passed, where cultures met, where power could be watched from stone towers, and where a conflict could burn brightly enough to survive in song long after the smoke had vanished from the plain. Across the Aegean from Troy, the world of the Mycenaean warrior kings rises from stone, bronze, stored grain, and disciplined fear. It is a world that later Greek poets remember as the Age of Heroes, but the palaces themselves tell a colder and more practical story. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and other centres do not look like the free city-states of later Greece. They are ruled from fortified heights and administrative halls, where power is gathered inward, counted carefully, and guarded behind walls so massive that later generations imagine giants must have built them. The men who rule these places live surrounded by symbols of command weapons, feasting vessels, imported luxuries, carved seals, chariot equipment, and storerooms filled with the material proof that their authority reaches far beyond the palace gate. Mycenae itself stands on a rocky height in the northeastern Peloponnese, watching routes through the Argive plain. Its walls are enormous, built of great limestone blocks that give the citadel an air of almost brutal permanence. The famous Lion Gate, with its heavy threshold and carved animals above the entrance, does not simply welcome visitors. It overwhelms them. Anyone passing beneath it enters a space where kingship is made into stone. The palace world depends on that effect. A ruler must be seen as the centre of order, the one who receives goods, redistributes wealth, commands workers, sponsors feasts, rewards followers, and organises violence when order is threatened. What survives in the record suggests that Mycenaean power is not loose or accidental. It is structured, hierarchical, and deeply concerned with display. The Linear B tablets, those dry administrative records baked by accident in palace fires, reveal a side of this world far removed from the music of epic. They record allocations of grain, oil, wool, bronze, livestock, land, personnel, and equipment. They list women workers, shepherds, smiths, officials, offerings, wheels, armour, and chariot parts. They are not literature, and that is precisely why they matter. They show the machinery beneath the heroic surface. The palace is a manager of resources. It knows who owes what, where goods are stored, which craftspeople are attached to which production systems, and how military supplies are maintained. Scholars still debate the exact political relationships among the Mycenaean centres, but the tablets make one thing clear: these kingdoms are capable of organising people and materials on a scale large enough to support ambitious warfare. The kings themselves remain partly hidden. Later tradition gives names such as Agamemnon and Menelaus, rulers whose honour, anger, and alliances drive the Trojan story. Archaeology cannot confirm those individual figures as historical persons, and it would be misleading to pretend otherwise. But archaeology does confirm the kind of elite society that could remember men like them. Shaft graves at Mycenae contain extraordinary wealth gold ornaments, decorated weapons, masks, cups, inlaid daggers, amber, and objects showing contact with wider networks. These burials do not prove the biography of any Homeric king, but they reveal a ruling class that presents itself through war, feasting, precious materials, and connection to distant worlds. Prestige is not an abstract idea here. It is buried with the dead. A Mycenaean ruler's power likely rests on several intertwined foundations. He controls land and agricultural production. He commands or negotiates with local elites. He oversees specialized crafts. He stores goods and redistributes them in ways that bind followers to the palace. He sponsors religious offerings and public ceremonies. He maintains warriors, chariots, and weapons. His authority may be sacred, practical, military, and economic all at once. No single explanation fully accounts for Mycenaean kingship, because the evidence is uneven and often indirect, but the pattern is unmistakable. This is a world in which status must be performed constantly, and warfare is one of its most visible performances. The warrior ideal runs deep. Bronze swords, spearheads, boar's tusk helmets, shields, and chariot imagery all point toward an elite culture fascinated by combat. Yet Bronze Age warfare is not always the clean, heroic duel imagined by later poetry. It includes raids, ambushes, sieges, intimidation, hostage-taking, destruction of crops, theft of livestock, and pressure on dependent communities. A king who leads men overseas is not necessarily chasing romance. He may be seeking plunder, tribute, access to trade, revenge for insult, or prestige among rivals at home. The evidence remains incomplete, but Mycenaean society appears well suited to organize violence. It has the administrative capacity to equip forces, the maritime experience to cross the Aegean, and the aristocratic culture to turn successful war into political capital. This matters for Troy because the Homeric tradition remembers a coalition, not a single kingdom acting alone. The Greek forces in the epic come from many regions, gathered under powerful leaders. The exact catalogue of ships in later poetry cannot be treated as a Bronze Age military document, but its existence reflects a memory of many communities bound into a shared campaign. Historically, such a coalition would be difficult but not impossible. Mycenaean palace states may have competed with one another, cooperated when useful, and participated in raiding or expeditionary ventures across the sea. Scholars still debate whether any one Mycenaean ruler could have commanded a true Pan-Aegean alliance, but the broader idea of multiple Aegean powers acting in western Anatolia fits the restless political world of the late Bronze Age. The sea gives these kings reach. Mycenaean pottery appears widely across the eastern Mediterranean, showing trade, exchange, imitation, and presence in foreign markets. Pottery does not equal conquest, and it should never be treated as a map of empire. Still, it shows that Mycenaean goods and taste travel far. Craftsmen, merchants, sailors, envoys, and warriors all move through overlapping networks. A palace ruler may not control every voyage, but he benefits from the wealth and knowledge these networks bring. To a Mycenaean elite, a city like Troy may not be a distant fantasy. It may be part of a known horizon, a place discussed by traders, visited by sailors, linked to stories of profit, danger, insult, or opportunity. There is a lesser-known tension in this palace world. Its impressive order may have made it vulnerable. Systems that count everything can become brittle when too many shocks arrive at once. If trade routes are disrupted, if harvests fail, if rival elites rebel, if earthquakes damage centres, if foreign conflicts drain resources, palace authority can weaken quickly. The same tablets that show control also reveal dependence. The palace must keep receiving, counting, storing, and redistributing. When that rhythm breaks, the walls still stand, but the system inside them begins to crack. This fragility will matter later when the wider Bronze Age world enters collapse. For now, it gives Mycenaean ambition a sharper edge. Strong kings may act boldly not only from confidence but from pressure. The contrast between Mycenae and Troy is therefore not a simple contrast between Greece and Asia, civilization and enemy, hero and victim. Both belong to a shared Bronze Age world of fortified centres, elite display, trade routes, and unstable borders. The Mycenaean kings are not noble adventurers sailing into a blank Eastern mystery. They are palace rulers from a militarized and competitive society. Looking across a sea they already know, their interest in Troy. If such an expedition truly occurred, would have been shaped by practical realities access, wealth, honour, retaliation, and the dangerous need to prove power before rivals. Later poetry turns these rulers into unforgettable figures. Agamemnon becomes the high king whose authority is never entirely secure. Menelaus becomes the wronged husband whose personal loss becomes political catastrophe. Odysseus becomes cunning intelligence in human form. Achilles becomes the terrible purity of martial glory and rage. These characters may preserve faint memories of aristocratic types rather than exact biographies. The arrogant commander, the injured king, the clever raider, the unmatched warrior, the aging counsellor, the proud young prince defending his city, all of them belong to a world where war and status feed one another. The poems make them larger than life, but the social soil from which they grow is historically real. To stand inside the ruins of a Mycenaean palace is to feel how different that world is from the later stories, and yet how easily it could give birth to them. The halls are gone, the roofs burned, the tablets hardened by disaster, the storerooms emptied, the kings nameless unless poetry has preserved distorted shadows of them. But the foundations remain enough to show a society that could launch ships, command labour, hoard bronze, reward warriors, and imagine glory as something worth dying for. If Troy is the city at the crossroads, Mycenae and its sister palaces are the engines of ambition across the water. Between them lies the Aegean, glittering and dangerous, carrying trade in one season and war in another. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War depends on this recognition. The conflict, if rooted in history, did not emerge from a world of simple tribes or fairy tale kingdoms. It came from palace states with archives, armies, workshops, ships, and pride. The Mycenaean warrior kings were capable of beauty, administration, long-distance exchange, and organized destruction. They lived in a world where a ruler's reputation could be as valuable as bronze, where insult and opportunity might be difficult to separate, and where a fortified city near the straits could become the perfect target for ambition. The legend remembers their names in song. The earth remembers their world in stone, ash, and clay. For centuries after the Bronze Age palaces fall silent, the Trojan War lives without needing a written book. It moves through voices, feasts, courts, festivals, and gatherings where singers shape memory into rhythm. Long before the Iliad and the Odyssey are written down in the forms known today, the story is carried by oral tradition, changing as it travels and surviving because people keep finding meaning in it. This is one of the most important truths behind the Trojan War, and also one of the most difficult to grasp. The poem's not simple reports from the battlefield, but neither are they weightless inventions. They are the result of a long process in which memories of a vanished world pass through generations of performance, absorbing new language, new values, old griefs, and the needs of audiences who live long after the original age has disappeared. In the world that follows the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces, writing in Greece largely fades from everyday administrative use. The linear B tablets, once used by palace scribes to count goods and manage resources, vanish with the palace system itself. For a time, Greek memory becomes more dependent on speech, song, ritual, and local tradition. This does not mean people forget everything. Human communities preserve the past in ways that are not always written. They remember lineages, migrations, ruins, old conflicts, sacred places, or ancestral claims. But oral memory does not preserve the past like a sealed jar. It reshapes, it condenses, it gives names to forces, turns many conflicts into one great war, and transforms human leaders into figures who can carry the emotional weight of a lost age. The singers who preserve these stories are not careless entertainers. They work within a disciplined tradition, formulaic phrases, repeated scenes, stock descriptions, and metrical patterns help them compose in performance. A warrior does not simply put on armor. The language of arming has a shape. A feast has a shape. A sacrifice has a shape. A ship launch. A duel. A lament. A council. A quarrel between powerful men all have inherited patterns that help the singer build a vast story without reading from a page. To modern ears, repetition can sound like ornament, but in oral poetry it is also technology. It is the memory system that allows enormous narratives to survive, expand, and remain recognizable across time. What survives in the record suggests that the Homeric epics are not sudden creations from nothing, but the polished surface of a much older tradition. The lesser-known detail is that this oral tradition can preserve surprisingly ancient material while also mixing it with later realities. The poems remember bronze weapons in a world that later knows iron. They describe great shields, boars' tusk helmets, chariots, palatial wealth, and heroic burial practices that feel older than the age in which the poems are likely written down. At the same time, they also contain social and political details that seem to belong to later centuries. This is not a flaw so much as a clue. The poems are layered, like Troy itself. Beneath one feature lies another. A Bronze Age memory may sit beside an Iron Age custom. A real place may be framed by mythic geography. An old war may be interpreted through the values of people who never saw a Mycenaean palace standing intact. Scholars still debate how much historical memory survives inside the epic tradition. Some argue that the poems preserve a genuine recollection of conflict between Aegean powers and a city in northwestern Anatolia. Others emphasize how much the stories have been shaped by poetic convention, myth, and centuries of retelling. Both cautions matter. It would be naive to read the Iliad as if it were a battlefield chronicle written by an eyewitness. It would also be too simple to dismiss it as pure fantasy, especially when archaeology confirms that Troy existed, that it was destroyed more than once, that the late Bronze Age world was violently unstable, and that Mycenaean Greeks had contact with Anatolia. The hidden truth lies in the tension between these facts. The poems remember something, but they do not remember it plainly. The Iliad itself does not tell the entire Trojan War. This surprises many people because the war is often imagined through its most famous scenes: the abduction of Helen, the gathering of the Greek fleet, the 10-year siege, the Trojan horse, the burning city. Yet the Iliad focuses on a brief period near the end of the conflict, centered on the rage of Achilles and the consequences of that rage. The horse does not appear in the Iliad's main action. The fall of Troy is not narrated there. The poem is less concerned with explaining the whole war than with exploring what war does to honor, friendship, pride, grief, and mortality. That narrow focus may actually make it more powerful. It assumes the audience already knows the larger story. The war exists around the poem like a vast dark landscape, only partly lit by the fire of Achilles' anger. This means the Trojan War tradition was larger than any single surviving work. Ancient audiences knew many stories connected to Troy, the judgment that leads to Helen's departure, the sacrifice before the fleet sails, the early raids, the deaths of lesser-known heroes, the arrival of allies, the building of the horse, the sack of the city, the returns of the Greek leaders, and the sufferings that follow victory. Much of this broader epic cycle survives only in fragments, summaries, or later retellings. The evidence remains incomplete, but those traces show that Troy was not one poem. It was a whole universe of memory. The surviving works are the mountains left standing after much of the range has eroded away. As the story passes through time, it becomes a mirror for the societies that tell it. For aristocratic audiences, it preserves ideals of fame, lineage, courage, and gift exchange. For communities living among ruins, it explains the presence of massive walls and tombs from an older age. For later Greeks, it becomes a shared heroic past, a way of imagining ancestors who were grander, harsher, and closer to the gods. For poets, it offers endless human contradictions. A war fought for honour that produces dishonour, a victory that brings ruin to victors, a hero who wins immortal fame by losing the life that fame is meant to glorify. No single explanation fully accounts for the survival of the Trojan story, but its emotional range is part of its strength. It can be a tale of glory, a warning against pride, a memory of collapse, and a lament for the dead all at once. The oral tradition also changes the scale of events. A conflict that may historically have been a raid, a siege, a regional war, or a series of related conflicts can become one immense 10-year struggle involving nearly every great hero of the age. This is how memory often works when communities look backward across centuries. Separate events merge. Local stories attach themselves to famous names. The causes of war become personal, because personal motives are easier to sing than supply chains. Maritime politics and diplomatic instability. A dispute over trade routes may become the theft of a queen. A coalition formed by political pressure may become an oath sworn by suitors. A city destroyed in a wider age of crisis may become the single blazing centre of heroic destiny. Yet poetic transformation does not erase historical value. Sometimes it preserves what formal records lose. A written treaty may tell the names of kings but not the fear of people waiting behind walls. A palace tablet may count bronze but not explain why men crossed the sea. A destruction layer may show ash but not grief. Epic poetry, for all its exaggeration, preserves emotional truths about warfare that archaeology can only imply. It remembers that elite pride can drag communities into disaster. It remembers that victory does not restore the dead. It remembers that cities are not abstract targets, but places filled with fathers, mothers, sons, daughters, elders, and household gods. Even if the names are shaped by legend, the human experience beneath them remains recognizable. The story's survival also depends on the ruins themselves. Ancient people saw remains of great walls and tombs from the Bronze Age, just as modern visitors do. These stones demanded explanation. They seemed to belong to a mightier past, a time when heroes could lift stones, ordinary humans could not. In Greece, the ruins of Mycenae and Tiryns helped nourish the imagination of a heroic age. In northwestern Anatolia, the mound of Troy gave the story a place to stand. Landscape and song reinforced one another. A singer could point, literally or imaginatively, toward a city that had fallen. The earth gave the poem weight. The poem gave the earth a voice. By the time the Homeric epics take the form that later generations inherit, the original Bronze Age is already distant. The palaces have fallen. The scribes of Lineabe are gone. Iron has entered common use. Political life has changed. Greek communities are moving toward new forms of identity and organisation. Yet the poems look backward to a world of bronze, chariots, kings, raiding, feasting, and monumental ruins. They do so with enough distance to mythologize it, but enough memory to preserve its atmosphere. That combination is why the Trojan War feels both impossible and strangely real. It belongs to poetry, but the poetry carries the scent of an older world. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War therefore cannot be found by stripping away every myth until only dry facts remain. The myth itself is part of the evidence, not because every scene is true, but because it shows what later people believed was worth remembering. A war at Troy, if it happened, did not survive as a date on a tablet. It survived because singers made it meaningful. They turned geopolitical conflict into human fate. They turned destroyed walls into lament. They turned the violence of the late Bronze Age into a story that could pass from mouth to mouth, long after the ships had rotted, the palaces had burned, and the names of real commanders had been lost. Beneath the song there may be history, but without the song, that history might have vanished completely into the dust. The story of Helen stands at the glowing centre of the Trojan War, but the closer it is examined, the less it behaves like a simple tale of romance. In later tradition, she is the woman whose departure from Sparta brings the greatest warriors of Greece across the sea, the face that becomes attached to ships, kings, vows, rage, and ruin. Yet behind the familiar image lies a darker and more political world. In the Bronze Age, elite marriage is rarely only private. It binds households, dynasties, territories, and alliances. A royal woman can carry legitimacy, wealth, inheritance claims, diplomatic value, and symbolic power. To lose such a woman, whether through abduction, elopement, political betrayal, or later poetic invention, is not merely to suffer personal shame. It can be understood as a public wound to authority. This is where the famous cause of the war begins to look less like a fairy tale, and more like a memory shaped into human form. The myth says Paris, a prince of Troy, takes Helen from Sparta while Menelaus is absent. The details vary across ancient versions. Sometimes Helen is willing, sometimes she's deceived or compelled, sometimes the gods are blamed, because divine desire is a useful way to explain human catastrophe. But whatever form the story takes, the result is the same. A woman tied to royal power leaves one court for another, and the injured side demands her return. Scholars still debate whether any historical incident lies behind this tradition, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the pattern is plausible in one important sense. In a world where royal marriages are political instruments, the disruption of such a marriage could become a serious diplomatic crisis. The Oath of the Suitors, another famous piece of the tradition, deepens the political meaning. According to later myth, many powerful men once sought Helen's hand, and they swore to defend the marriage chosen for her. When she is taken, that oath forces them to join Menelaus and Agamemnon in war. As literal history, the story is impossible to verify. It may be a later narrative device designed to explain why so many Greek leaders take part in the campaign. Yet as poetic memory of coalition politics, it is revealing. Bronze Age rulers do not simply gather armies because someone feels insulted. They need obligations, alliances, pressures, rewards, and shared interests. The oath turns a complicated political mechanism into a memorable story. It gives the audience a clear reason for a vast mobilization, while preserving the deeper truth that elite promises can become traps. Marriage alliances could be dangerous because they created expectations across distance. A woman sent from one elite house to another might carry dowry goods, retainers, ritual obligations, and political trust. If that arrangement broke down, the consequences could ripple outward. The return of Helen in the story is not only about recovering a wife, it is about restoring a damaged order. Menelaus cannot simply ignore the insult without looking weak. Agamemnon, as his brother and a more powerful ruler in the tradition, cannot ignore it without losing prestige. Other rulers, if bound by oath or advantage, may find themselves drawn into a conflict whose emotional cause hides more practical motives. No single explanation fully accounts for the legendary coalition, but the story of Helen gives politics a human face. There is also the matter of honour, a word that can sound abstract until it is placed inside a warrior aristocracy. In such societies, a status is not fixed securely forever. It must be defended, displayed, and recognised by others. A ruler's honour is tied to his household, his possessions, his dependents, his gifts, his ability to reward friends and punish enemies. An insult left unanswered can become an invitation to further insult. This does not mean every story of heroic anger reflects a real Bronze Age custom exactly, but it does suggest a world in which reputation has material consequences. A king who cannot recover what has been taken from him may lose allies. A king who successfully punishes an offender may gain fear, respect, and plunder. The war for Helen, when stripped of divine glamour, becomes a story about public authority under threat. The legend also preserves something uncomfortable about women in elite political systems. Helen is made central to the war, but she's rarely allowed full control over her own meaning. She becomes cause, prize, symbol, accusation, excuse, and memory. Later poets and audiences argue over whether she is guilty, victimized, enchanted, irresponsible, or trapped by forces larger than herself. That uncertainty may reflect the deeper ambiguity of royal women's roles in ancient diplomacy. They can be powerful and powerless at once. Their marriages matter enormously, yet their own voices are often missing from the record. What survives in the tradition suggests that Helen's figure absorbs anxieties about desire, loyalty, foreignness, and the fragility of male political order. The war is blamed on her beauty, but the machinery that turns beauty into catastrophe belongs to kings. The fleet that gathers in the legend is equally symbolic. Ships are more than transport. They represent coordination, wealth, manpower, and shared purpose. To launch a major expedition across the Aegean would require food, crews, weapons, leadership, and timing. It would mean persuading or compelling many communities to risk men and resources far from home. The story says the Greeks gather at Aulis, delayed by winds and divine anger before they can sail. Beneath the mythic language is a realistic problem fleets are vulnerable to weather, logistics, and morale. Even before battle, a coalition can begin to fracture. Leaders quarrel, supplies run low, omens, rituals, and sacrifices become ways of managing fear in a world where the sea can destroy ambition before the enemy ever appears. One of the most disturbing parts of the wider Trojan tradition is the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Agamemnon's daughter, offered in some versions so the fleet can sail. This story does not belong to the main action of the Iliad, but it becomes central to later reflections on the war's moral cost. As history, it cannot be confirmed, and it should not be treated as evidence for a specific event. Yet as myth, it reveals a grim intuition. Great wars demand payment before they even begin. The coalition that claims to defend marriage and honour is already stained by violence within its own household. The story suggests that the expedition against Troy is not pure justice moving across the sea. It is ambition wrapped in obligation, and its first victims may be those closest to power. The figure of Agamemnon makes the political structure more tense. He is remembered as the leader of the Greek coalition, but his authority is never effortless. He commands, but other kings have their own pride. He can summon, but not fully control. In the Iliad, his conflict with Achilles shows how fragile coalition leadership can be when powerful warriors feel dishonoured. This may preserve a broader truth about aristocratic warfare. A campaign made from multiple leaders is always vulnerable to rivalry. Each ruler wants glory, reward, recognition, and a share of plunder. If the war drags on, unity becomes harder to maintain. The cause that once seemed clear begins to blur under fatigue, resentment, and competition. Troy, from the other side, would not have seen the matter as a romantic correction of wrongdoing. If a prince of Troy truly became involved in a diplomatic scandal with a foreign royal woman, the city would face an agonizing calculation. Returning her might mean humiliation or internal division. Keeping her might invite war. If the story is purely symbolic, the same political logic still holds. A disputed alliance, a broken agreement, a contested marriage tie, or a claim of insult could force leaders into positions where compromise becomes difficult. Ancient wars often grow not because every side wants destruction from the beginning, but because each step makes retreat more costly. By the time armies gather, the original cause may matter less than the reputations now tied to it. This is the hidden force inside the Helen story. The myth reduces the cause of war to a woman's departure, but the deeper structure is about networks of obligation. One royal house claims injury, another refuses or cannot repair it. Allied rulers are pulled in by oath, opportunity, fear, or ambition. Ships gather because the conflict has become larger than the people at its centre. The face remembered by poetry may be Helen's, but the body of the war is made of politics. There is a dry irony in this, because the most famous love story of the Bronze Age may not be a love story at all. It may be an elegant poetic cover for the kinds of disputes that often lead real states into violence-damaged prestige, contested alliances, competition for influence, and the need of rulers to appear strong before their peers. Scholars still debate how much of the Helen tradition reflects any actual Bronze Age event, and no single explanation fully accounts for its endurance. But its endurance itself is meaningful. People kept telling the story because it made war intelligible. It gave a human beginning to a conflict whose real causes may have been too tangled, too political, or too ordinary to sing. By the time the fleet turns toward Troy in the imagination of later generations, the war has already become more than a rescue mission. It is a test of kingship. It is a stage for rivalry. It is an assertion that insult must be answered across the sea. It is also a sign of how fragile the late Bronze Age order may have been, because a system built on alliances can be shaken when one alliance fails. Helen stands at the doorway between private desire and public catastrophe. The oath turns memory into obligation. The fleet transforms grievance into invasion, and somewhere beyond the water, the city at the crossroads waits behind its walls, about to become the place where every hidden pressure of this world is brought violently into the open. Far from the song of Greek poets, in the clay archives of Anatolia, the Trojan world appears in a different kind of shadow. There are no shining heroes here, no long speeches over fallen warriors, no gods stepping down into the dust. There are letters, treaties, complaints, royal instructions, and diplomatic fragments from the Hittite Empire, a major power whose rulers watched Western Anatolia with a mixture of interest and frustration. These documents do not tell the Trojan War as later tradition remembers it. They do something stranger and, in some ways, more valuable. They show that the lands around Troy were not empty mythic space. They were part of a real political frontier, unstable, contested, and entangled with powers from across the Aegean. The Hittites ruled from central Anatolia, from a heartland far inland, where the imperial capital at Hattusa stood behind formidable walls of its own. From there, kings managed a broad and difficult realm, held together by treaties, vassal obligations, military campaigns, dynastic arrangements, and constant negotiation with neighbouring states. Their scribes wrote in cuneiform on clay tablets, recording matters that often seem dry until their implications are understood. A broken treaty clause, a complaint about a rebellious ruler, a reference to a foreign power stirring trouble near the coast. These are the administrative fingerprints of a world in motion. The evidence remains incomplete, because many tablets are damaged, many places are debated, and ancient names do not always map neatly onto modern geography. But the Hittite records open a door that poetry alone cannot open. Two names matter, especially Wilusa and Ahiawa. Wilusa appears in Hittite texts as a place in western Anatolia, associated by many scholars with the region of Troy. The resemblance between Wilusa and the Greek Ilios, another name for Troy, has drawn serious attention, though linguistic similarity alone is never enough. Geography, treaty relationships, and the broader political context strengthen the possibility. Ahiawa, meanwhile, is widely discussed as a possible Hittite name for the Mycenaean Greek world, or at least for a powerful Aegean entity connected to it. The link between Ahiawa and Achaea, the Homeric term for the Greeks, is tempting, and many scholars accept some form of connection, though debates remain over exactly what Ahiawa was: a single kingdom, a loose network, a dominant Mycenaean centre, or a term used by the Hittites for Aegean powers more broadly. This is where the hidden truth becomes tantalizing. If Wilusa is Troy, and if Ahiawa is connected to Mycenaean Greeks, then Hittite records may preserve a faint historical outline behind the later epic tradition, a western Anatolian city or kingdom known to imperial scribes, and an Aegean power capable of interfering in Anatolian affairs. This does not prove the Iliad. It does not give the names of Achilles, Hector, Helen, or Agamemnon. It does not describe a 10-year siege, but it suggests that the basic geopolitical setting of the Trojan story is not fantasy. Western Anatolia really was a region where local rulers, Hittite authority, and Aegean influence could collide. One important text often discussed in this context is the so-called Alexandru Treaty, an agreement between a Hittite king and Alexandru, ruler of Wilusa. The name Alexandru has sometimes been compared with Alexander, another name attached to Paris in later Greek tradition. The resemblance is intriguing, but it must be handled carefully. Similar names do not automatically reveal identity, and centuries of transmission separate the Hittite document from the later poetic tradition. Still, the treaty shows that Wilusa had a recognized ruler and formal relations with the Hittite Empire. It was not a nameless village. It existed within the diplomatic architecture of the age. That fact alone gives Troy, if Wilusa is indeed Troy, a firmer place in history. Another remarkable document, often called the Tawagalawa letter, refers to disputes involving Ahiawa and western Anatolian territories. The details are damaged and complex, but the tone reveals that the Hittites treated Ahiawa as a power worthy of serious diplomatic language. At times, the Hittite king seems to address the ruler of Ahiawa with a respect approaching that given to great kings, although scholars still debate the implications. This is a lesser-known but crucial point. The Mycenaean world, often seen through Greek ruins and later poetry, also appears from the eastern side as a foreign power whose actions matter to an empire. The Aegean was not peripheral in Hittite eyes. It was troublesome, capable, and politically relevant. Then there is the name Piyamaradu, a figure who appears in Hittite texts as a disruptive actor in western Anatolia, associated with raids, rebellion, and possible Ahiawan support or refuge. He is not a Homeric hero, and attempts to equate him with specific epic figures are speculative, but he reveals the kind of instability that could generate memories of war. Western Anatolia seems to have been a landscape of shifting loyalties, local dynasts, imperial pressure, and overseas connections. A rebel could trouble Hittite authority while drawing strength from maritime networks. A coastal power could influence inland politics without conquering everything directly. In such a world, the line between diplomacy, piracy, rebellion, and war becomes thin. The Hittite records also show how different real Bronze Age politics are from the clean lines of myth. In the epic imagination, the Greeks and Trojans stand opposed in a grand moral and heroic struggle. In the archives, the picture is messier. Local rulers seek advantage, great kings demand loyalty, border states maneuver, names appear, vanish, and reappear in damaged contexts. Alliances shift. A city might be loyal to the Hittites at one moment and vulnerable to Aegean influence at another. The Greeks, if Ahiawa represents them, are not described as a unified heroic race sailing for a stolen queen. They appear as a political force across the sea, sometimes distant, sometimes involved, sometimes difficult for Hittite power to manage. No single explanation fully accounts for these fragments, but they make the world behind the Trojan legend feel more historically dense. The geography of Wilusa adds another layer. If it lies in or near the Troad, then it occupies a frontier zone between the Hittite sphere and the Aegean maritime world. This position would make it valuable, but also exposed. Hittite control over western Anatolia was not always direct or secure. Distance matters. Mountains, local identities, rival states, and seaborne interference all complicate imperial authority. A city near the Dardanelles could maintain ties to the Hittites while also trading with, or being pressured by, Aegean powers. It could become a hinge between worlds, and hinges are often the first places to strain when large systems begin to twist. What the Hittite evidence does not provide is just as important as what it does. It does not give a neat confirmation of Homer. It does not tell of a wooden horse or a woman named Helen. It does not describe Achilles sulking beside his ships, or Hector standing before the gates. The absence matters, but it does not end the discussion. Most ancient conflicts, even significant ones, are only partially recorded or not recorded at all. Archives survive by accident, and clay tablets preserve the concerns of states, not the full texture of human events. A war that later becomes legendary among Greeks may appear in Hittite records only as one episode among many Western disturbances, or not survive in the preserved tablets at all. This contrast between archive and epic is one of the most revealing parts of the Trojan mystery. Poetry remembers the war from the inside of heroic emotion. Hittite documents, if they touch the same world, remember it from the outside of administration and imperial concern. One gives names that may be legendary, the other gives names that may be historical but emotionally bare. Between them lies a gap where interpretation must be careful. It is possible that the Trojan War tradition grew from a real conflict involving Wilusa and Ahiawa. It is also possible that several conflicts, diplomatic crises, raids, and destructions were later fused into one grand story. Scholars still debate these possibilities, and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet the archives make one thing harder to deny: the Trojan War story belongs to a plausible geopolitical setting. There really were powerful Aegean actors. There really was a western Anatolian frontier. There really were Hittite concerns about influence, loyalty, and disorder in that region. There really was a place called Wilusa that many scholars connect with Troy. These facts do not solve the mystery, but they narrow the distance between myth and history. They show that the epic tradition did not simply invent a great eastern city at random. It remembered, however dimly, a world where Aegean warriors and Anatolian rulers could meet not only in trade, but in hostility. So the search moves from sung memory to written fragments, from the ringing names of heroes to the damaged words of imperial scribes. The Hittite tablets do not burn with poetry, but they carry their own quiet drama in them. Troy is not yet the doomed city of later imagination. It is part of a living political landscape, watched by kings, bound by treaties, and exposed to pressure from the sea. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War grows deeper here, because the archives suggest that behind the legend of a stolen queen may lie something more historically familiar: frontier politics, imperial anxiety, maritime interference, and a city caught between powers larger than itself, somewhere between Wilusa and Ilios, between Ahiawa and Achaea. The song begins to touch clay. If the Trojan War has a historical core, its real causes are likely to be less elegant than the legend and more revealing. A woman's departure, an oath of kings, and a wounded husband give the story a memorable beginning. But the Bronze Age world around Troy points toward deeper forces. Cities do not usually endure long conflict because of one private insult alone. Fleets do not cross dangerous seas. Rulers do not spend men and supplies. And fortified settlements do not become targets unless other pressures are already waiting beneath the surface. The hidden truth may be that the Trojan War, whatever its exact historical shape, was born from the ordinary engines of ancient power trade: access, prestige, fear, wealth, rivalry, and the need of rulers to prove that they could not be ignored. Troy's location near the Dardanelles stands at the centre of this more grounded explanation. Movement between the Aegean and the Black Sea regions may not have worked like modern commercial traffic, with fixed toll stations and predictable customs records, but the importance of the passage is difficult to dismiss. Ships that moved through or near these waters faced currents, winds, seasonal limits, and the need for safe stopping places. A city positioned near this maritime threshold could profit from contact, influence exchange, and become entangled in disputes over access. It did not have to control the straits in an absolute way to become important. In the Bronze Age, even partial influence over a route could matter. A friendly harbour, a hostile ruler, a protected anchorage, or a local alliance could change the fortunes of merchants and kings alike. Trade itself is not peaceful by nature. It can create wealth, but wealth attracts pressure. The same routes that carry copper, tin, textile, grain, oil, wine, and luxury goods also carry information about who is rich, who is weak, and who can be threatened. The difference between trader and raider may depend on the season, the strength of local defences, or the instructions of a distant ruler. A ship arriving with gifts in one year may be part of a hostile expedition in another. Scholars still debate how organised Mycenaean maritime power truly was, but the broader Eastern Mediterranean shows constant overlap between exchange and coercion. Trade routes create relationships, and relationships create disputes. A city like Troy could become wealthy because it connects worlds, then endangered because others want access to the same connection. Metals offer one possible layer of motive. Bronze Age power depends heavily on bronze, and bronze depends on copper and tin moving through long-distance networks. Copper is widely associated with places such as Cyprus, while tin sources are more difficult and may have involved distant and varied routes. The exact paths of tin movement remain debated, but the strategic importance of metals is not weapons, tools, fittings, armour, and elite display all rely on materials that no single palace world can produce entirely on its own. Disrupted access means more than inconvenience. It threatens the military and economic foundations of elite society. A conflict near a major crossing or coastal route may therefore be tied not to one commodity alone, but to the broader anxiety of keeping valuable movement open. Grain and food security may have mattered as well. Palatial societies depend on agricultural surplus, and surplus is never guaranteed. Weather, crop failure, local unrest, and population pressure can turn nearby resources into objects of competition. The Troad, the region around Troy, had agricultural land, access to herding zones, and connections inland. It may not have been the breadbasket of the entire Bronze Age world, but local production and stored supplies would have mattered greatly in conflict. A besieging army needs food. A city under siege needs stored food. A ruler seeking influence needs the ability to feed followers. What survives in the record suggests that late Bronze Age societies were deeply concerned with storage and distribution, because hunger is one of the quiet forces behind political collapse. Prestige is less tangible than bronze or grain, but in a warrior aristocracy it can be just as dangerous. Mycenaean rulers compete not only for resources, but for recognition. A successful overseas expedition can bring plunder, captives, exotic goods, and songs that strengthen a ruler's standing at home. Failure can weaken authority. In such a world, Troy may have been valuable not only for what it possessed, but for what victory over it would mean. To defeat a strong city at a famous crossing would create a reputation. To force tribute or punish an insult would show strength. To return home with wealth from Anatolia would feed both palace storerooms and elite imagination. No single explanation fully accounts for the legendary scale of the war. but prestige may have helped turn practical conflict into memorable violence. There is also the possibility of piracy or raiding. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was full of movement, and not all of it was orderly. Coastal raids could disrupt settlements, capture people, seize livestock, and provoke retaliation. A series of raids and counter-raids around the Aegean and Anatolian coast might later be condensed into one enormous war. This is a crucial possibility because oral tradition tends to organize messy histories into clear stories. Many smaller acts of violence are spread across years or generations can become remembered as one grand siege. The evidence remains incomplete, but this pattern is common in human memory. Communities prefer a story with a beginning, cause, climax, and fall. History often offers only overlapping crises. Diplomacy may have failed in ways later myth transforms into personal betrayal, a broken alliance, an insult to envoys, interference with a vassal ruler, refusal to return goods or captives, or a dispute over marriage ties could all lead to escalating conflict. In the Hittite world, such matters were not minor. Treaties, oaths, and obligations structured relationships between rulers. If Wilusa was tied to Hittite authority, while also interacting with Aegean powers, then its political position may have been difficult. A ruler there might try to balance larger forces, accept gifts from one side while promising loyalty to another, or become trapped when distant powers demanded clarity. Borderland diplomacy often works until it does not. The Hittite texts hint at this kind of instability in Western Anatolia. They do not tell a neat Trojan War, but they reveal a region where local rulers, imperial authority, and outside interference create repeated trouble. If Ahiawa does reflect Mycenaean involvement, then Aegean powers were not strangers to Anatolian politics. They could support rebels, shelter fugitives, pressure coastal states, or engage in disputes that alarmed Hittite rulers. In that context, a war involving Troy does not need to begin with a single romantic scandal. It could grow from accumulated grievances. The legend of Helen may preserve the emotional truth of an insult while concealing the diplomatic and strategic causes beneath it. Another overlooked factor is the psychology of coalition warfare. Once multiple rulers commit to an expedition, their motives do not have to be identical. One leader may seek revenge, another plunder, another trade advantage, another political survival, another the chance to display courage before rivals. A coalition can gather under a single public cause while carrying many private ambitions. This makes the Trojan tradition more plausible as political memory. The Greeks in the epic are united, but never entirely harmonious. Their quarrels feel realistic because shared war does not erase competition, it intensifies it. If a historical expedition against Troy existed, it may have drawn together men whose reasons for fighting were varied, unstable, and sometimes contradictory. Troy's own choices would have mattered. The city is often imagined only as the victim of Greek aggression, but a real Troy would have had its own rulers, alliances, ambitions, and mistakes. It may have profited from controlling access. It may have supported one faction over another. It may have harboured enemies of a Mycenaean ruler. It may have refused demands that seemed unreasonable. It may simply have stood in the wrong place during an age when powerful neighbours were becoming more desperate. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is impossible to reconstruct Troy's policy in detail. But the city should not be treated as a passive stage. It was likely an actor in its world, even if later poetry remembers it mainly as the doomed object of attack. The deeper background is the growing strain of the late Bronze Age system. Palace economies, long-distance trade, elite diplomacy, and military competition create wealth. But they also create dependence. When everything works, goods move, rulers boast, and cities flourish. When routes become unsafe or harvests falter, the same interconnection spreads fear. A local conflict over access or honour can become more dangerous if the wider system is already stressed. A city that once served as a bridge can become a bottleneck. A rival once tolerated can become intolerable. the Trojan War, if it occurred near the end of this age, may have been one spark among many in a world full of dry timber. This is why the real causes of the war cannot be reduced to one secret. The hidden truth is not that Helen never mattered, or that trade alone explains everything, or that a single document will eventually solve the puzzle. The more likely truth is layered. A memory of personal insult may rest on a foundation of alliance politics. A story of heroic rescue may cover competition for roots and prestige. A famous siege may condense years of raiding, diplomacy, and regional struggle. A city's destruction may have been remembered so powerfully because it happened at a crossroads during a time when many other parts of the world were also beginning to break. The legend survives because it simplifies without becoming empty. It gives a face to political crisis, a city to regional conflict, and heroes to the violence of systems. But beneath the poetry are harder forces. Ships need harbours, kings need honour, palaces need metals, warriors need rewards, border cities need allies, trade creates wealth, and wealth creates enemies. Troy stands where all of these pressures can meet, whether the war lasted 10 years or far less. Whether the attackers were a grand coalition or a smaller force later magnified by song, the causes behind it belong to history's most familiar pattern. People fight where power, profit, fear, and memory converge. A siege beneath the walls of Troy would not have looked like the clean, shining contest later imagination prefers. It would have been slower, dirtier, more anxious, and more dependent on hunger than heroism. The city's walls may have seemed almost alive to those approaching them, rising from the mound with stone strength and human intention. Towers and gates controlled movement. Defenders could watch the plain, count fires in an enemy camp, measure the number of ships or shelters, and listen for the sounds that travel strangely at night across open ground. For attackers, the walls were a problem of endurance. A city that could not be stormed quickly had to be pressured, isolated, frightened, starved, tricked, or drawn into battle outside its defences. Bronze Age warfare was capable of violence, but it was not always capable of the kind of mechanical siege operations familiar from later empires. Large battering engines, heavy artillery, and advanced siege towers belong more securely to later periods, although earlier armies certainly knew how to assault gates, undermine defences, use fire, build ramps, and exploit weaknesses. The evidence remains incomplete for exactly how a conflict at Troy would have been fought. Still, a long struggle around a fortified settlement is historically plausible. The attackers may have tried raids on the surrounding countryside, attacks on outlying communities, efforts to cut supplies, and repeated attempts to force defenders into open combat. A war remembered as a 10-year siege may, in practical terms, have included long pauses, seasonal campaigning, raids against neighbouring towns, and periods when the attackers themselves struggled simply to remain fed. The plain before Troy would have mattered as much as the walls. Armies do not live on courage alone. They consume grain, animals, water, wood, leather, and time. If a Mycenaean-led force landed nearby, it would need ships pulled up on shore or anchored in safe places, camps established, guards posted, supplies organised, and communication maintained across the sea. Horses and chariots, if present, would require fodder and care. Men would fall sick. Leaders would argue over spoils and strategy. The longer the war lasted, the more the invading force would become a temporary society of its own, with hierarchies, resentments, rituals, and routines. The epic tradition remembers the Greek camp as a place of quarrels, feasts, plague, grief, and restless honour. Beneath the poetry is a very real truth. An army far from home can become as fragile as the city it surrounds. Inside Troy, the experience would have been different, but no less severe. A fortified city under threat has to turn inward. Gates are watched more carefully. Food storage becomes political. Families may crowd into safer areas. People from the lower settlement or surrounding countryside may seek protection behind stronger defences. Increasing pressure on grain, water, and space. Archaeological interpretations of Troy 7a have noted signs that may suggest crowding and increased storage within domestic spaces, including large jars set into floors. Scholars still debate exactly what these clues mean, but they create a vivid possibility, a community preparing for shortage or living under stress. In such a city, war is measured in small daily reductions. Less grain, less room, less certainty, more smoke on the horizon. The defenders would not have been helpless. Troy's walls gave it strength, and its knowledge of a local terrain may have offered advantages. It could receive help from allies inland or along the coast. It could launch sorties, harass besiegers, protect supply lines, or wait for disease and weather to weaken the enemy. A siege is not simply the attacker acting and the defender enduring. It is a contest of patience, information, morale, and miscalculation. The Trojans of legend fight outside the walls in great battles, and while the details are poetic, the broader pattern makes sense. Defenders of a city may choose to fight beyond the gates to protect fields, challenge enemy morale, prevent encirclement, or demonstrate that they are not yet trapped. Each sortie, however, risks irreplaceable men. The role of chariots in such a war remains debated. In the Homeric poems, warriors often ride to battle in chariots and then fight on foot, a practice that does not perfectly match the way chariots are used in Near Eastern battlefield warfare, where they could function as mobile platforms for archers or elite shock forces. This mismatch may reflect layers of memory and later poetic adaptation. The poems preserve chariots because they belong to the heroic past. But the tradition may no longer fully understand their Bronze Age tactical use. Still, chariots were prestigious military equipment in the late Bronze Age, requiring specialized production, horses, maintenance, and skilled handling. Their presence in memory suggests a world where elite warfare is tied to display as much as efficiency. Weapons would have been intimate and brutal. Bronze swords could cut and thrust, but spears were likely central to combat. Shields protected bodies in close fighting, arrows could wound at distance, and sling stones or thrown weapons may have played roles that poetry often understates. Armour was expensive and unevenly distributed. Some elite warriors may have worn impressive protective gear, while many fighters relied on simpler equipment. Death in such a setting would not be the tidy fall of heroic art. It would be broken bone, torn flesh, infection, thirst, panic, and the confusion of men trying to recognize friends through dust. No single explanation fully accounts for how Bronze Age battle at Troy would have unfolded, but it almost certainly involved far more disorder than the later beauty of the story suggests. A lesser-known but important part of siege warfare is negotiation. Cities do not always fall by assault. They bargain, stall, exchange envoys, offer tribute, return captives, swear oaths, or try to divide enemy coalitions. The Trojan War tradition contains moments of council, embassy, and attempted settlement, and these may reflect a real feature of ancient conflict. A war over honour or access could still include repeated attempts to end the fighting without annihilation. Perhaps demands were made, perhaps compensation was offered, perhaps factions inside Troy disagreed over whether to hold out or compromise. Perhaps among the attackers some leaders wanted plunder while others wanted settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, but the possibility matters because it makes the war more human. Destruction is often the result not of silence, but of failed conversations. Disease may have been as dangerous as bronze. Camps are vulnerable places, especially when large numbers of men, animals, refuse, and limited water sources are crowded together. The Iliad opens with a plague in the Greek camp, framed as divine punishment. But the image has a practical reality beneath it. Armies sicken, bodies contaminate water, heat and poor sanitation weaken men before combat does. The ancient mind explained such suffering through gods, omens, and ritual anger. But the historical body suffers through microbes, hunger, exhaustion, and exposure. A long siege could kill without a single decisive battle. It could grind both sides down until the final catastrophe is less a sudden miracle than the breaking point of a system already near collapse. The surrounding countryside would pay heavily. Fields might be burned or harvested by enemy forces, herds might be stolen, villages outside the walls could be abandoned, raided, or forced to supply one side. People not named in any poem would suffer most directly: farmers, shepherds, servants, women carrying water, children hiding in storage rooms, old people unable to flee quickly, craftspeople whose tools could not protect them. Epic tradition focuses on aristocratic warriors because that is where its idea of honour lives. Archaeology reminds us that cities are communities. If Troy burned, it was not only a royal tragedy, it was the end of kitchens, workshops, sleeping rooms, courtyards, shrines, and family memories. Night would have changed everything. In daylight, the walls, plain, and camp could be watched. At night, fear multiplied. Defenders might listen for digging, movement near gates, or the creak of timber. Attackers might fear sorties, fire, or ambush. Fires in the camp would mark human presence, but also vulnerability. The city's walls might glow faintly under moonlight, and beyond them the dark shape of enemy ships could remind everyone that the war is not local anymore. The sea has brought strangers, and as long as their ships remain, the danger remains. A siege is psychological long before it is decisive. The famous 10 years of the Trojan War may not be a literal duration. It may be a poetic number expressing long suffering, endurance, and the exhaustion of a generation of warriors. Many ancient traditions use large rounded spans to give emotional shape to memory. Yet even if the real conflict was shorter, it could have felt endless to those trapped inside it. A single campaigning season can ruin harvests. A few months of blockade can empty stores. Repeated attacks over several years can transform a wealthy city into a frightened stronghold. The memory of duration may preserve not a calendar, but an experience Troy did not fall easily. This stubbornness is crucial to the legend. A city that collapses at first contact rarely becomes the centre of epic memory. Troy's fame depends on resistance. The walls hold. Heroes die before them. The attackers cannot simply take what they want. Time stretches. Anger deepens. The original cause, whatever it was, becomes buried beneath accumulated losses. By the end, no one is fighting only for Helen, only for trade, only for honour, or only for revenge. They are fighting because too much has already been spent to stop without meaning. That is one of war's oldest traps. The siege beneath the walls, then, is where the hidden truth becomes most human. Strategic geography brings the armies there. Palace ambition supplies the leaders. Oral tradition gives them immortal names. But the siege itself belongs to bodies, hunger, weather, fear, and patience. It is the grinding middle of history, the part less easily turned into a single image than the horse or the burning city, but perhaps closer to what actually happened. The stones of Troy may have watched seasons change while men below them sickened, argued, prayed, raided, buried companions, and waited for a weakness to appear. When the city finally fell, if it fell by assault, treachery, fire, or some combination of pressures now lost to time, the destruction would have seemed sudden only to those who had not endured the long wearing down that came before it. The Trojan horse enters the story like something too strange to be ordinary history and too powerful to be dismissed as mere decoration. After years of struggle, after the deaths of heroes and the exhaustion of both armies, the Greeks appear to give up. They leave behind a massive wooden horse, an object that seems at once sacred, suspicious, and irresistible. The Trojans bring it inside the walls, and during the night the hidden warriors emerge. Gates open. The Greek force returns. Troy burns. In one image, The whole war turns from endurance to deception, from siege to sudden collapse, from proud resistance to irreversible ruin. No wonder the horse survives in memory. It is not just a trick. It is the nightmare that a city's own victory celebration may become the doorway to its destruction. Yet the horse is also one of the hardest parts of the Trojan tradition to treat historically. The Iliad does not narrate it as part of its main action. The fuller story appears in other ancient traditions, later summaries, and especially in the Odyssey and post-Homeric material. By the time the horse becomes one of the most famous images in the world, it has already passed through centuries of storytelling. Scholars still debate what, if anything, lies behind it. It may be a pure poetic invention. It may preserve a distorted memory of a siege engine. It may symbolize a ship, a sacred offering, an earthquake, a ritual deception, or an old story attached to the fall of the city after the real details were forgotten. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the power of the image. One practical theory is that the horse represents a siege device. Later Greeks sometimes used animal names for military machines, and a large wooden structure used to approach or breach walls could, in memory, become a horse. This possibility is attractive because it translates myth into technology. A wooden device outside the walls becomes a wooden horse. Hidden men become soldiers protected within or behind it. The city's fall becomes the result of military ingenuity rather than magic. But the problem is evidence. There is no direct proof that such a device was used at Troy in the late Bronze Age, and large sophisticated siege engines are more securely documented in later periods. The theory remains plausible as metaphor, but uncertain as fact. Another interpretation sees the horse as connected to Poseidon, a god associated not only with the sea, but also with horses and earthquakes. Troy 6 shows evidence of major destruction that many archaeologists have associated with seismic activity, though the precise interpretation is debated. If an earthquake damaged the walls and allowed enemies to take the city, later memory might have transformed the event into a story involving the sacred animal of Poseidon. In this reading, the horse is not a machine but a symbol of the force that breaks Troy open. The idea is elegant, but again uncertain. Troy's destruction layers are complicated, and the layer most often connected with the traditional war is not always the one most strongly associated with earthquake damage. Still, the link between horses, divine force, and ruined walls shows how natural disaster and human violence can merge in ancient memory. A third possibility is that the horse reflects ritual deception. Ancient societies often treat sacred offerings with caution and reverence. A large object dedicated to a deity could be seen as dangerous to reject, especially after a long war full of omens and divine explanations. The Trojans in the tradition debate whether to bring the horse inside, and the fatal decision is framed not only as foolishness, but as a failure to read signs correctly. This matters because Bronze Age and later ancient warfare is never purely military. Religion, omen interpretation, sacrifice, and sacred object shape decisions. A city might make a disastrous choice not because its people are stupid, but because the moral and religious logic of the age pressures them toward the wrong action. What survives in the tradition suggests a deep anxiety about interpretation. The signs are there, but human beings do not know how to read them until too late. There is also the possibility that the horse is a story born from the shape of memory itself. A city falls after a long siege. Later generations ask how such strong walls could have been breached. Ordinary explanations may not satisfy. Hunger is too slow. Betrayal is too common. A gate opened by bribery, panic, or factional conflict may be too politically uncomfortable. A secret trick gives the fall a shape worthy of epic. It preserves the humiliation of defeat, but turns it into drama. The horse allows the Trojans to be brave and still doomed, the Greeks to be exhausted and still cunning, the city to be strong and still vulnerable. In mythic terms, it solves a narrative problem. Troy cannot fall easily, so it must fall strangely. Behind the horse stands Odysseus, the figure of intelligence that moves where brute force fails. Whether or not any historical commander inspired him, his role in the tradition is revealing. The war is not won only by strength. Achilles' rage, Hector's courage, Agamemnon's authority, and Ajax's endurance cannot take the city. In the end, cunning enters where force has stalled. This may preserve a practical truth about siege warfare. Fortified cities often fall through deception, treachery, negotiation, internal division, or unexpected weakness rather than heroic frontal assault. The horse is a poetic exaggeration of a common reality. Walls protect against enemies outside, but no wall is safe once the danger is inside. The burning of Troy, unlike the horse, has firmer archaeological resonance, though not a simple one. Several layers at the site show destruction, and the late Bronze Age levels most relevant to the Trojan War debate include evidence of violent or catastrophic endings. Troy 7, A, often discussed as a possible candidate for the Homeric city's destruction, appears to have ended in fire and disruption. Archaeologists have found signs that may include burned remains, damaged buildings, and conditions suggesting stress before the end. But identifying the attackers, the exact date, and the relationship between this destruction and later epic tradition remains difficult. A burned city proves disaster, not the Iliad. Still, the fact that a plausible late Bronze Age Troy suffered destruction keeps the legend attached to the earth. Fire is a powerful preserver and destroyer. It consumes wood, roofs, stored goods, and human life. But it can harden clay, seal floors, and leave marks that archaeologists read thousands of years later. In a burning city, the air becomes thick with smoke, and visibility collapses. Roof beams fall, storage jars crack, animals panic, people run toward gates, courtyards, shrines, or family members. A palace or citadel that once projected order becomes a maze of heat and fear. The epic tradition frames the sack of Troy through heroic vengeance and divine fate. But the physical event would have been immediate and chaotic. For those inside, the hidden truth of the war would not be strategy. It would be the moment when stone walls no longer mattered. The sack of a city in the ancient world is almost always more terrible than the stories can comfortably admit. Victors take goods, captives, livestock, metal, textiles, and women. Men of fighting age may be killed. Children and elders may be slaughtered, enslaved, or scattered. Sacred places may be violated or stripped. Houses cease to be private. The city's memory is broken into portable objects carried away by enemies. Later poetry knows this horror. Even when it turns away from full description, the fall of Troy becomes a warning because victory is not clean. The Greeks win, but their victory stains them. Many of them suffer on the journey home. Some never return. Some return to households already poisoned by absence. The destruction of Troy spreads outward like smoke. A lesser-known detail in the wider tradition is how much anxiety surrounds the treatment of sacred objects and supplicants during the sack. Stories of violence at altars, the killing of Priam, the fate of Cassandra, and the carrying away of Trojan women all suggest that the fall is remembered not simply as military success, but as moral catastrophe. These stories cannot be treated as direct historical reports, but they reveal ancient awareness that the destruction of a city crosses boundaries. War may be justified at the beginning by honour, oath, or revenge. At the end, when people are dragged from temples and houses burn, justification becomes harder to hear. The legend preserves that discomfort. If the horse has a historical root, it may lie in some combination of deception, engineering, ritual misunderstanding, and later symbolic imagination. Perhaps a gate was opened from within. Perhaps attackers exploited earthquake damage. Perhaps a wooden structure was involved. Perhaps the city fell through famine and betrayal, and the horse later gave the fall a more memorable form. The evidence remains incomplete, and responsible history must leave room for uncertainty. But uncertainty does not weaken the story. It is part of its force. The horse stands precisely where knowledge fails, filling the gap between archaeological destruction and human need for explanation. The burning city also marks a transformation in memory. Before the fall, Troy is a place. After the fall, it becomes a symbol. Its walls no longer defend bodies, they defend meaning. For Greeks, it becomes a stage on which heroic identity is tested. For later Romans who trace ancestry through the Trojan survivor Aeneas, it becomes a lost homeland, a noble ruin from which another destiny rises. For modern archaeology, it becomes a question buried in layers. The same destruction can serve different memories. One people sings victory, another imagines exile, another digs through ash and asks what happened. This is why the horse and the burning city cannot be separated. The horse explains how the impossible happened. The fire proves that the impossible, at least in some form, did happen to Troy more than once. A strong city fell, whether by trick, assault, earthquake, starvation, betrayal, or later poetic fusion. The result was remembered as sudden night violence after long endurance. The hidden truth may not be that a literal wooden horse stood outside the walls exactly as later stories describe. It may be that Troy's fall was so shocking, so humiliating, and so difficult to explain that only a symbol as strange as the horse could carry it. In the end, the horse is less a solution than a doorway. It leads from the practical world of siege into the psychological world of memory. It tells of trust betrayed, signs misread, pride punished, and walls made useless by what people choose to welcome. The burning of Troy, meanwhile, brings the story back to matter ash, cracked stone, collapsed rooms, broken pottery, and the silence after shouting stops. Between the image and the evidence lies the deep mystery of the Trojan War. Something happened at Troy. A city was damaged, perhaps destroyed, in the age when the Bronze Age world itself was beginning to fracture. Later generations remembered that fall not as a line in a record, but as a night when a horse entered the walls and an ancient city became flame. Troy does not fall in an empty century. Around the same broad horizon in which later memory places the war, the Eastern Mediterranean world begins to break in ways that still disturb historians, because the collapse is too large for one easy cause. Palaces burn, trade routes weaken, administrative systems vanish, cities are abandoned, damaged, or transformed. Old diplomatic networks lose their rhythm. Kingdoms that once exchanged gifts and threats across great distances suddenly struggle to survive. The destruction of Troy, if it belongs to this late Bronze Age storm, may not be only the end of one famous city. It may be one burning point inside a much wider unravelling, a crisis in which many centres of power discover that their walls, archives, and royal names cannot protect them from the collapse of the world that made them strong. The late Bronze Age had been built on connection. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, the Levantine cities, and other powers were tied together through diplomacy, trade, marriage alliances, luxury exchange, and shared dependence on resources moving across land and sea. This network could make rulers wealthy beyond anything their local fields alone could support. It carried copper, tin, grain, timber, ivory, horses, textiles, and prestige goods. It allowed palaces to display foreign luxuries and to imagine themselves as members of an international order. But connection is also vulnerability. When a system depends on many links, a shock in one place can become pressure elsewhere. No single explanation fully accounts for the late Bronze Age collapse, but almost every serious explanation begins with the fact that the system was complex, interdependent, and easier to damage than its monuments suggest. In mainland Greece, the Mycenaean palaces suffer destruction or severe decline. Pylos burns, and its linear B tablets survive because the fire that destroys the palace bakes the clay records hard. Mycenaean triremes endure damage and transformation. The administrative world, revealed by the tablets, disappears. The scribes no longer count sheep, oil, bronze, wheels, and workers for palace redistribution. The great centres do not all vanish in the same instant, and scholars still debate the sequence and causes, but the pattern is unmistakable. The palace system fails. When it fails, writing used for administration largely disappears from Greece for centuries. This is not simply a change of rulers, it is a breakdown in the machinery of daily power. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire also collapses. The capital at Hattusa is abandoned and destroyed, though the exact nature of its final days remains debated. Some regions continue under successor states, and not every part of Hittite culture disappears, but the imperial system that once managed treaties, vassals, armies, and archives is gone. For Troy, this matters deeply. If Wilusa was tied to the Hittite diplomatic world, then the weakening or collapse of Hittite authority would have changed the balance of power in Western Anatolia, a city that once relied on imperial protection, recognition, or political structure may have become more exposed. Aegean forces, local rivals, migrating groups, or internal factions may all have found new opportunities in the disorder. The causes of the wider collapse remain one of the great debates of ancient history. Earthquakes may have damaged some centres, droughts and climate stress may have strained food production, internal rebellions may have weakened palace authority. External attacks, including movements of groups later called the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records, may have struck vulnerable coastlands. Trade disruptions may have deprived elites of essential materials. Social inequality and over-centralized administration may have made palace systems brittle. Each explanation has evidence in some places and limits in others. The truth is likely not one catastrophe, but a convergence. A drought does not need to burn a palace by itself if it creates hunger, migration, unrest, and military pressure. An earthquake does not need to destroy a civilization if rebuilding is possible. But if trade is already failing and enemies are moving, one shock can become decisive. This is the world in which Troy's fall becomes more historically plausible. A city at a strategic crossing may be valuable during stability, but during collapse it can become dangerously exposed. If trade falters, people fight harder over what remains. If palace rulers lose control, raiding may increase. If old diplomatic restraints weaken, disputes can turn violent more quickly. If hungry groups move across landscapes and coastlines, fortified settlements become both refuges and targets. Troy's defences might protect it for a time, but they could also mark it as a place worth attacking. The same walls that display wealth can attract desperation. The archaeological evidence at Troy suggests episodes of destruction and rebuilding through multiple periods, and the late Bronze Age levels sit close to this broader age of disruption. Troy 6, with its impressive walls, appears to end in major damage, often linked by many scholars to earthquake, though not without debate. Troy 7a, a smaller but densely occupied successor, shows signs that some interpret as stress, crowding, and preparation for hardship before a destructive end. If this layer is connected to the historical memory behind the Trojan War, then the city remembered by epic may have been one already living in the shadow of instability. The great walls of the earlier phase may have survived in memory, while the final crisis may have unfolded in a more crowded and anxious settlement. The evidence remains incomplete, but that possibility fits the larger pattern of a world under pressure. The Sea Peoples, often invoked in discussions of the collapse, require caution. Egyptian inscriptions describe attacks by groups with names that have been debated for generations, and these records show serious conflict in the Eastern Mediterranean. But it's too simple to imagine a single migrating horde sweeping across every palace and city. The term itself is modern, grouping together peoples mentioned in Egyptian sources under particular circumstances. Some may have been displaced groups, raiders, mercenaries, migrants, or coalitions formed by crisis. Their role was real in some regions, but not a universal explanation. For Troy, there is no clear evidence that a named Sea Peoples group destroyed the city. Still, the wider atmosphere of maritime violence and movement is relevant, the sea that once carried trade could also carry ruin. Climate adds another quiet pressure. Evidence from various regions suggests episodes of drought and environmental stress around the end of the Bronze Age. Though the timing and severity differ by area, drought does not produce dramatic ruins by itself, which is why it can be underestimated in stories of collapse. It works slowly, harvests shrink, reserves fall, people move, rulers demand more from communities that have less to give, trade becomes more desperate, armies become harder to feed. In a palace economy, food shortage can become political crisis. If Troy's region experienced environmental pressure alongside military and diplomatic instability, then its vulnerability would deepen. Scholars still debate the exact scale of climate's role, but it belongs in the pattern of cumulative stress. Earthquakes, too, may have contributed to the age's instability. The Aegean and Anatolian regions are seismically active. A major earthquake can crack walls, collapse buildings, kill inhabitants, and disrupt storage. But earthquake destruction is rarely the whole story. Strong communities rebuild, weaker ones may not. The significance of seismic damage depends on context. If Troy 6 was damaged by earthquake, as many have argued, then the city's later inhabitants may have rebuilt within a changed political and economic environment. A natural disaster could weaken defences, reduce population, disrupt confidence, or create an opening for enemies. In ancient memory, earthquake and war might merge, especially when later generations know only that the great city fell. The collapse also changes memory itself. When palace archives disappear and literacy patterns shift, oral tradition gains even greater importance. Communities living after the catastrophe look back on the Bronze Age through ruins, heirlooms, graves, and stories. They see massive walls and imagine heroes. They inherit weapons and transform their former owners into legends. The fall of many cities may have become condensed into a few unforgettable tales. Troy, because of its location, its visible ruins, and the power of the story attached to it, becomes the chosen vessel for remembering an age of destruction. It is possible that the Trojan War tradition contains not only a memory of one conflict, but echoes of a wider collapse that later storytellers focused through one city's fate. This does not mean the war is merely a metaphor for collapse. It may have had a real historical core, perhaps a siege, raid, or regional conflict involving Mycenaean and Anatolian powers, but the reason it survived so powerfully may be that it resonated with a broader experience of endings. The Greeks who preserved the tradition lived after the palatial world had fallen. They knew, at some level, that the heroic age was gone. Troy's destruction became a way to imagine that loss. The victorious Greeks of the story do not return to a stable paradise. Many suffer disastrous homecomings. Some are murdered, some wander, some find their households broken. Victory at Troy is followed not by clean triumph, but by fragmentation. That pattern feels like a cultural memory of collapse. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War therefore widens beyond Troy itself. The city may have fallen because of local causes: a siege, betrayal, earthquake damage, hunger, political miscalculation, or attack from Aegean rivals. But local causes unfolded inside a regional crisis. The Late Bronze Age was a system under strain, and strained systems turn ordinary conflicts into irreversible disasters. A city that might once have survived a raid may fall when allies fail to come. A palace that might once have rebuilt after fire may vanish when trade no longer supports it. A ruler who might once have negotiated may choose war because weakness is more dangerous than risk. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and that is the point. Collapse is often not a single blow. It is a sequence of blows landing before recovery is possible. By placing Troy inside this wider catastrophe, the legend becomes less isolated and more haunting. It is not only the story of a city destroyed by cunning Greeks, it is the story of a world in which many cities are becoming vulnerable at once. The horse, the walls, Helen, Achilles, and Hector belong to poetry, but behind them stand real structures of Bronze Age life palaces, trade routes, treaties, food stores, maritime crossings, and fragile alliances. When those structures begin to fail, even a strong city near the Dardanelles can become ash. The war remembered at Troy may have been one flame in a whole horizon of fire, and that may be why the story carries such weight. It remembers not merely a victory, but the sound of an age breaking. The modern search for Troy begins with a paradox. The city was famous for thousands of years, yet proving what lay beneath the legend required digging through a hill that had already become almost too meaningful to touch. Ancient travellers, poets, geographers, and local traditions kept the region of the Troad connected with the story. But memory is not the same as archaeology. A mound can carry a name for centuries and still conceal many different histories beneath it. By the 19th century, European fascination with Homer had turned Troy into more than a ruined place. It became a test of whether epic poetry could lead modern people back to the Bronze Age, whether imagination could point toward fact, and whether a story sung for generations had left a physical wound in the earth. The mound now known as Hisarlik drew attention because its location fit the ancient tradition better than rival candidates. It stood in northwestern Anatolia, near the plain and waterways associated with Troy, not far from the Dardanelles. To those searching for Homer's city, the landscape itself seemed to whisper confirmation. Yet the first major excavations were not careful by modern standards. Frank Calvert, a diplomat and amateur archaeologist who owned part of the mound, had already recognized the promise of Hisarlik before Heinrich Schliemann made the site famous. Calvert's role is sometimes overshadowed in popular memory, but it was crucial. Schliemann brought money, energy, publicity, and obsession. Calvert brought local knowledge, earlier insight, and a more measured understanding that the mound deserved serious attention. Schliemann's work in the 1870s transformed Troy into a global archaeological sensation, but also into a cautionary tale. He dug with enormous ambition, driven by the desire to find the city of Homer. In doing so, he cut a great trench through the mound, damaging later layers that are now understood to be among the most relevant to the Trojan War question. His methods were not unusual for the rougher archaeology of his era, but the consequences were severe. In the hunger to reach the heroic past, he destroyed parts of it. The evidence remains incomplete, partly because time damaged Troy, partly because ancient destruction damaged it, and partly because modern discovery arrived with tools too blunt for the mystery it wanted to solve. Schliemann believed he had found the Troy of Priam when he uncovered a rich cache of precious objects, later called Priam's treasure. The name was dramatic, memorable, and wrong. The treasure came from a level far older than the likely horizon of the Trojan War tradition. It belonged to an earlier Troy, a city already ancient when the late Bronze Age conflict, if historical, would have occurred. This mistake is one of the most revealing moments in the search. The mound was not a simple container holding one legendary city. It was a layered archive of settlements going back thousands of years. To find gold was not necessarily to find Homer. To find destruction was not necessarily to find the war. Archaeology had to become more precise before Troy could be understood at all. Later excavators began to separate the layers more carefully. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who worked with Schliemann and then continued at the site, recognized that the impressive walls of Troy 6 were better candidates for the great city of epic memory than the earlier level Schliemann had celebrated. Troy 6 had large fortifications, monumental architecture, and signs of prosperity. Its walls seemed worthy of the legend. But Troy 6 appeared to have ended in a way many interpreted as earthquake damage. Not necessarily human attack. This complicated the picture. If the most impressive city had not fallen to an army, perhaps the epic memory attached its grandeur to a later destruction, or perhaps earthquake and war had become entangled in tradition. Scholars still debate these questions, because the layers do not arrange themselves to satisfy the poem. Attention then turned strongly toward Troy 7a, a settlement built after Troy 6 and often dated close to the traditional period of the Trojan War. It was less grand in some respects. but it showed signs that invited historical imagination-crowded occupation, storage jars sunk into floors, adaptations that could suggest stress, and a destructive end involving fire. For those seeking a real siege behind the legend, Troy 7a became a compelling candidate, yet it, too, resists certainty. Crowding can have more than one cause. Storage may reflect preparation, economic change, or normal domestic practice under altered conditions. Fire may come from war, accident, or internal crisis. What survives in the record suggests hardship and destruction, but not a named attacker. 20th century archaeology brought more disciplined methods and broader questions. Carl Blegan and his team from the University of Cincinnati excavated at Troy in the 1930s and refined the chronological sequence. Their work helped clarify the many phases of occupation and destruction, giving scholars a firmer framework for debate. Later excavations under Manfred Kaufmann expanded attention beyond the citadel, arguing that Troy had a significant lower settlement and was therefore larger and more important than earlier images allowed. This claim generated debate, including arguments over the size, defensive features, and significance of the lower city. The discussion itself shows how alive the problem remains. Troy is not just found once, it is reinterpreted as methods improve and new questions are asked. One of the most important shifts in modern archaeology is that Troy is no longer treated only as the setting of Homer. It is studied as a real settlement within Anatolian, Aegean, and broader Eastern Mediterranean networks. This matters because the search for a single epic city can distort everything. If every wall is judged only by whether Achilles might have seen it, the actual history of the place becomes smaller. Troy was occupied, rebuilt, damaged, and transformed across many centuries. It had lives before and after the supposed war. Its inhabitants were not waiting for Greek poetry to make them meaningful. They were farmers, traders, rulers, craftspeople, guards, and families living in a strategic and sometimes dangerous landscape. The excavations also show how difficult it is to match archaeology with oral tradition. Poetry remembers grandeur, but grandeur can belong to one layer while destruction belongs to another. A later poet may imagine the walls of Troy 6 while preserving a memory of the destruction of Troy 7. The name of a city can persist across rebuilding, so more than one Troy can be historically connected to the tradition. A population may survive a catastrophe and tell stories that blend old and recent memories. The mound itself encourages fusion. Each new city rises from the old. People living on the hill may have seen fragments of earlier walls around them, just as later generations did. At Troy, memory is physically layered. There is a lesser-known tragedy in the modern history of the finds themselves. Priam's treasure, wrongly named but archaeologically extraordinary, was removed from the Ottoman Empire by Schliemann in violation of agreements, later displayed in Europe, and eventually taken to Russia after the Second World War, where its ownership remains a matter of cultural dispute. This modern journey of the treasure has nothing to do with the Bronze Age War directly, yet it echoes the themes of the story in an uncomfortable way: prestige, possession, plunder, and the struggle over who has the right to claim the past. Even the objects found at Troy have lived through a history of conflict after their excavation. Modern science has added new tools to the old question: pottery analysis, radiocarbon dating, geomorphology, archaeobotany, residue studies, and regional survey all help reconstruct the environment and chronology. Researchers study ancient coastlines, river deposits, settlement patterns, and material connections. These methods do not produce the simple answer popular imagination wants, but they make the world of Troy more real. They show changing landscapes, imported goods, local continuity, and signs of stress. They make it possible to ask not only whether the Trojan War happened, but what kind of society stood there, how it interacted with neighbours, and why it might have been vulnerable. Still, the deepest limitation remains. Archaeology can reveal that a city was burned, but not always why. It can show that people stored food, but not whether they feared a siege, a famine, or a hard winter. It can uncover arrowheads, but not always whether they belonged to attackers, defenders, hunters, or later disturbances. It can identify destruction, but not the song that destruction later becomes. The search for Homer's city is therefore a discipline of restraint. Every tempting clue must be handled with care, every dramatic connection must be weighed against alternative explanations. No single excavation fully accounts for the legend, and no responsible interpretation can turn the poems into straightforward reports. And yet the mound has answered one great question. Troy was real. It was not merely a fantasy city floating in epic imagination. It stood in the right region, in a strategic position, with substantial Bronze Age remains, impressive fortifications, signs of connection, and evidence of destruction. That does not prove the war as sung. It does prove that the song chose a place with deep historical roots. The city beneath the legend had enough reality to support memory, enough complexity to resist simplification, and enough mystery to keep scholars arguing long after Schliemann's trench first cut through the hill. Digging for Homer's city, then, has become less about finding one perfect confirmation and more about understanding the strange partnership between earth and story. The poets preserved Troy as a moral and heroic landscape. Archaeologists uncovered Troy as a sequence of human settlements. Between them, a richer truth emerges. The Trojan War may never be proven in every detail, but the ruins show that the legend grew around a real place marked by wealth, danger, destruction, and survival. The Hill of Hisarlik is not a stage prop for myth. It is an archive, scarred by ancient fire and modern ambition, still holding in its layers the stubborn silence of a city that became immortal because it fell. The evidence for the Trojan War is powerful enough to keep the question alive, but not complete enough to let the mystery close. This is the uncomfortable centre of the whole investigation. Troy exists. Late Bronze Age, Troy was fortified, strategically placed, and connected to the wider world. The Mycenaean palace world was capable of long-distance warfare and had contact with Anatolia. Hittite records speak of Western Anatolian politics, Wilusa, and Ahhiyawa in ways that may overlap with the world later remembered in Greek epic. Archaeology shows destruction at levels close to the period in which a historical conflict might have occurred. Oral tradition preserves a story of a great war against a city in exactly the kind of place where geopolitical pressure would make sense. Taken together, these clues are too strong to ignore. Taken separately, none of them proves the war exactly as later generations told it. The first thing the evidence can prove is the reality of the place. Troy is not a poetic invention without roots. The mound at Hisarlik contains a long sequence of settlements, including late Bronze Age levels with substantial fortifications and signs of regional importance. This matters because many legendary places vanish when pressed against the earth. Troy does not. It stands where ancient tradition expects it to stand, near the Troad, near the Dardanelles, within a landscape that fits the strategic logic of the story. But proving the city existed is not the same as proving the Iliad happened. A real city can attract unreal stories. A real destruction can grow into a mythic war. A real conflict can be remembered through characters who may never have lived in the form poetry gives them. The second thing the evidence can support is that Troy had enough importance to be worth fighting over. Earlier generations sometimes imagined the site as too small to fit the grandeur of epic. But later research complicated that view. The citadel was only one part of the settlement, and the surrounding lower town may have made Troy more substantial than once believed. Its walls, location, material connections, and long occupation suggest a community of some significance. It may not have been a vast imperial capital, but it did not need to be. In the ancient world, a city at a crossing, with access to trade and regional networks, could become a prize far larger than its physical size. What survives in the record suggests that Troy was important enough to be noticed, defended, and remembered. The third point concerns destruction. Troy's late Bronze Age layers do show catastrophic events, but the challenge is matching them to the war. Troy, 6, impressive and prosperous, seems to have suffered severe damage, often interpreted as earthquake-related. Troy, 7a. Less monumental but chronologically attractive for many scholars, appears to have ended violently or destructively, with signs that some have read as evidence of siege conditions or social stress. Yet archaeology does not write motives into ash. Burned buildings do not name attackers. Crowded rooms do not automatically prove blockade. Storage jars do not speak of fear unless other evidence helps them do so. The evidence remains incomplete, and each interpretation must remain open to alternatives. This is where dating becomes crucial. Ancient tradition, as later Greeks calculated it, often placed the Trojan War around the late 13th or early 12th century BCE, though those dates come from much later attempts to organise heroic memory into chronology. Archaeological phases at Troy can be dated broadly through pottery, stratigraphy, radiocarbon evidence, and comparison with wider material culture, but the margins are not always narrow enough to satisfy the legend. A destruction close to the traditional date is intriguing. It is not a signature. The war, if historical, may not have happened in the exact year ancient chronographers imagined. It may have been remembered from events spread across decades. It may have involved the destruction of one layer and the memory of another. The mound's complexity makes precision difficult. The Hittite evidence strengthens the historical background but stops short of confirmation. Wilusa may well be connected with Ilios, and Ahiawa may well refer to a Mycenaean or Aegean power. These identifications are widely discussed and taken seriously, but they do not give a direct narrative of the Trojan War. They show a world in which such a conflict could occur: Western Anatolian states, Hittite treaties, Aegean involvement, rebellious figures, diplomatic friction, and coastal instability. That is not a small thing. It moves the Trojan story from pure legend into a historically plausible zone. But plausibility is not proof. The archives provide shadows of the right kind of world, not the full silhouette of Homer's war. The absence of certain evidence matters too. There is no contemporary Mycenaean inscription celebrating the sack of Troy. There is no Hittite tablet stating that Ahiawan armies destroyed Wilusa in a war over a Spartan queen. There is no royal tomb at Troy securely identified with Priam. No weapon marked as Hector's. No Greek camp excavated in a way that confirms the epic siege. This absence does not mean nothing happened. Most Bronze Age events left no surviving narrative record at all. But absence does place limits on certainty. Responsible history must resist the desire to fill every silence with the most famous story available. The poems themselves must be handled with equal care. The Iliad preserves old material, but it is not a Bronze Age document in the strict sense. It emerges from a long oral tradition and reaches written form centuries after the world it describes. Its language is layered. Its customs are mixed. It contains memories of bronze weapons and chariots, but also later social realities. It compresses, transforms, and moralizes. Yet it also preserves details too strange and old-fashioned to be dismissed easily. The presence of Bronze Age elements suggests inherited memory. The presence of later elements shows adaptation. Scholars still debate how to weigh these layers, because oral tradition can remember and reinvent at the same time. One important mistake is to ask whether the Trojan War was true in the same way a modern war is true. Ancient memory does not operate like modern documentation. It may preserve the emotional and geographic core of an event while changing names, motives, numbers, and sequence. A real war might become 10 years long in song because it felt immense in memory. A coalition might become Panachaean because later Greek identity needed a shared heroic past. A local diplomatic crisis might become a war for Helen because audiences understand personal betrayal more easily than trade politics. A siege that ended through treachery, famine, earthquake damage, or negotiation might become the story of a wooden horse because the fall of a great city demanded an unforgettable image. Another mistake is to divide the matter too sharply into true or false. The Trojan War may be partly historical without being literally Homeric. There may have been a Mycenaean-led attack on Troy or Wilusa. There may have been several attacks over time. There may have been Aegean raids against the Troad that later merged into one war. There may have been a local Anatolian conflict remembered through Greek heroic tradition because Greeks were involved as raiders, allies, mercenaries, or enemies. There may have been a destruction at Troy that oral tradition attached to older memories of Mycenaean grandeur. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, but several historically grounded models remain possible. The scale of the war is especially uncertain. The epic describes a vast expedition with leaders from many Greek regions and a conflict that seems to involve the heroic world as a whole. Archaeology cannot confirm an invasion on that scale. A more modest campaign is easier to imagine historically: a coalition of several Aegean rulers, a major raid, a siege of limited duration, or repeated conflict over a strategic city. Yet modest events can grow in memory when they occur at the right place and time. If Troy fell during the wider Late Bronze Age collapse, its destruction may have become attached to the sense that an entire age had ended. Scale in poetry may measure meaning rather than numbers. The identity of the attackers also remains uncertain. If Troy 7a was destroyed violently, were the attackers Mycenaean Greeks, local rivals, displaced groups, internal enemies, or some combination? The epic gives the answer clearly. Archaeology does not. Mycenaean pottery at Troy shows contact, not conquest. Weapons or destruction debris can indicate violence, but not always the cultural identity of those responsible. The Hittite texts show Aegean interference in western Anatolia, but not a clear sack of Troy. A war involving Greeks remains plausible, but not proven. This uncertainty is not failure. It is the honest boundary between evidence and desire. The defenders are equally difficult to define. Were the Trojans speakers of an Anatolian language? Did they identify with a kingdom known as Wilusa? Were they culturally mixed? Drawing from both Anatolian and Aegean traditions, the material evidence suggests a city in a contact zone, not a simple ethnic category. Later Greek poetry turns Trojans into noble foreigners who often resemble Greeks in customs, speech, and values because epic poetry makes enemies understandable to its audience. Historical Troy may have been more complex, local, Anatolian, connected, multilingual, politically flexible, and shaped by centuries of exchange. What survives in the record suggests not a sharp civilizational clash, but a frontier conflict in a shared Bronze Age world. This is perhaps the most important conclusion the evidence can support. The Trojan War, if historical, was not a war between the classical West and the East, not a clash of later civilizations, and not a moral drama between freedom and despotism. Those are later projections. In the late Bronze Age, Mycenaean Greeks and Trojans belonged to overlapping networks of trade, diplomacy, warfare, and elite culture. They used different languages and had different political ties, but they were not strangers from separate planets. Their conflict, if it happened, was likely one of borderlands, sea routes, prestige, and regional power. The legend made it universal, history makes it specific, and yet specificity does not make it smaller. A real conflict at Troy, even if less grand than epic, would still matter because of what it reveals about the end of the Bronze Age. It would show how a strategic city could become trapped between larger forces. It would show how maritime powers projected violence across the Aegean. It would show how oral tradition preserved the memory of a ruined world. It would show how archaeology, language, and poetry can approach the same event from different angles without ever fully meeting. The evidence can prove the stage, the atmosphere, the plausibility and the catastrophe. It cannot prove every actor or every motive. So the hidden truth is not hidden because one final clue has been deliberately concealed. It is hidden because time has broken the record into different kinds of fragments. Clay tablets preserve diplomacy, but not epic grief. Poetry preserves grief, but not administrative precision. Archaeology preserves destruction, but not the name shouted in the smoke. Later tradition preserves memory, but also transforms it. Between these fragments, the Trojan War remains visible only in outline. Like a city seen through dust at sunset, the form is there and the details waver. This may be the only honest answer the evidence allows. Troy was real. A late Bronze Age destruction was real. Aegean and Anatolian powers did interact, compete, and sometimes collide. A war or series of conflicts around Troy is historically plausible. The Homeric version is not literal history, but it may preserve the memory of real violence transformed by centuries of song. The proof is strong enough to make belief reasonable, but too incomplete to make certainty possible. And that uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is why the story still lives. The Trojan War remains suspended between ash and poetry, between what can be held in the hand and what survives only because human beings refuse to stop telling it. The Trojan War survives because it is never only about Troy. If it were merely the memory of one city's destruction, it might have remained a local legend, attached to a mound, repeated by nearby people, and slowly absorbed into the dust with countless other ruined places. Instead, it becomes one of the great shared memories of the ancient Mediterranean. It travels through Greek song, Athenian drama, Roman ancestry, medieval manuscripts, Renaissance painting, modern archaeology, and every later age that finds itself drawn to the image of a beautiful city burning after a long struggle. Its endurance is not an accident. The story survives because it gathers many fears and desires into one-shaped glory: betrayal, homecoming, loss, pride, fate, violence, and the fragile belief that civilization can be defended by walls. For the Greeks, Troy becomes a mirror in which they can imagine their own heroic past. The people who preserve and reshape the epic tradition are not Mycenaean palace subjects. They live after the collapse, in a world that has changed politically, socially, and materially, yet the ruins of the Bronze Age remain visible around them. Massive walls stand at Mycenaean Tiryns. Old tombs hold the aura of forgotten rulers. Objects from earlier centuries turn up in the landscape like messages from a stronger, stranger age. It is natural that later communities would imagine the people who built those walls as heroes. The Trojan War gives those imagined ancestors a common stage. It makes the scattered memories of old palaces into one grand age of action. This is one reason the story becomes so powerful. It creates unity from fragmentation. The Greek world of the early first millennium BCE is divided into communities with their own local identities, rivalries, dialects, and traditions. Yet the Trojan War tradition gathers many regions into a shared heroic enterprise. Leaders come from different places. Their ships assemble. Their quarrels continue, but they fight beneath a common memory. This does not mean the epic reflects an actual united Greek nation in the Bronze Age. That would be a later projection. But the story helps later Greeks imagine a past in which their ancestors, however divided, once acted together. Memory becomes a form of cultural architecture, building a shared roof over many separate houses. The Iliad's genius is that it does not make this unity easy. The Greek coalition is full of tension. Agamemnon commands, but his authority is resented. Achilles is necessary, but uncontrollable. Odysseus is clever, but not always comforting. Ajax is strong, but strength does not save him from tragedy in later tradition. The Greeks fight together, yet their greatest crisis comes from within their own camp. This is one reason the poem feels so old and yet so permanent. It knows that alliances can fail from pride before enemies defeat them from outside. The war against Troy becomes a way to think about the danger inside power itself. No single explanation fully accounts for the poem's survival, but its refusal to simplify victory is one of its deepest strengths. Troy survives in memory for the opposite reason as well. It gives dignity to the defeated Hector, Priam, Andromache, and the people inside the walls are not treated as faceless enemies. They are given grief, duty, tenderness, fear, and nobility. This matters greatly. A story that only celebrates conquest can burn brightly for a time, but a story that mourns both sides can survive for millennia. The Trojans are foreign, yet recognizable. Their city is doomed, yet loved. Their defenders are fated to lose, yet not made meaningless by defeat. What survives in the record suggests that the epic tradition, however shaped by Greek audiences, preserved a profound sympathy for the city it destroyed in song. That sympathy turns Troy from an enemy stronghold into a human place. The figure of Hector is central to this transformation. Achilles may be the greatest warrior, but Hector is the defender of the city, the man whose death signals that Troy's walls are already spiritually broken. He fights not for abstract glory alone, but for family, duty, and the survival of his people. Whether or not he reflects any historical individual is impossible to know. As a literary figure, however, he carries the emotional truth of every doomed defender in history. His presence ensures that the fall of Troy cannot be remembered as simple Greek triumph. It becomes a tragedy in which the loser may appear morally steadier than the victors. This moral complexity gives the story a life far beyond its original cultural setting. The women of Troy also shape the story's endurance. Helen, Andromache, Hecuba, Cassandra, and the captive Trojan women become vessels for the memory of what war does after warriors have finished naming their honour. Their suffering shifts attention from battlefield fame to the consequences of conquest. In later Greek tragedy, especially, Troy becomes the place where victory is put on trial. The defeated women speak, lament, and expose the cost that heroic narratives try to contain. Even when their voices are created by male poets in male-dominated societies, their presence keeps the story from becoming a clean celebration of martial success. The evidence remains incomplete for any historical lives behind them, but the emotional pattern is unmistakable. A city's fall is measured most honestly by those who must live after the gates are broken. The returns of the Greek heroes deepen this unease. If the Trojan War were simply a glorious victory, the story might end with the city burning and the victors sailing home in triumph. Instead, the aftermath is filled with shipwrecks, murders, wanderings, curses, and broken households. Agamemnon returns only to be killed. Menelaus wanders. Odysseus spends years struggling home. Others suffer or vanish into lesser-known traditions of disaster. This is not accidental. The mythic imagination understands that war follows men home. It changes households, kingdoms, and bodies. Victory does not erase the violence used to achieve it. The hidden truth here is not archaeological, but psychological. The ancient tradition knows that a city's destruction damages the destroyers as well as the destroyed. For later Greeks, Troy becomes a source of artistic and political meaning. Cities claim heroic ancestors. Families trace prestige through figures connected to the war. Poets return to the story because it contains nearly every human conflict worth exploring: loyalty against pride, duty against desire, public honour against private grief, bravery against futility, memory against oblivion. The war becomes a storehouse of examples: a statesman, warrior, exile, ruler. Or grieving parent can find some reflection of himself or herself in its ruins. This adaptability helps explain its survival. The Trojan War is specific enough to feel grounded and vast enough to be endlessly reused. Then Rome transforms the memory again, through the figure of Aeneas, the defeated Trojan survivor. Roman tradition claims a lineage not from the Greek victors, but from the ruined city. This is a remarkable act of cultural reimagining. Troy, Once the object of Greek victory becomes the noble source of Rome's destiny, the destruction is no longer only an ending, it becomes a beginning hidden inside catastrophe. Aeneas carries his household gods from the flames, wanders, suffers, and eventually becomes linked to the future foundation of a new power. The defeated city becomes an ancestor of empire. This does not prove anything about Bronze Age Troy, but it shows the extraordinary flexibility of the memory. One culture sings the city's fall as victory. Another uses the same fall as origin. Medieval and later European traditions continue to reshape Troy. Kings and peoples invent genealogies leading back to Trojan exiles. Writers treat Troy as a lesson in love, betrayal, chivalry, fortune, and the instability of worldly power. Artists paint its burning walls. Scholars argue over its location. The war becomes a kind of cultural inheritance, even for people far removed from the Aegean. This long afterlife can obscure the Bronze Age reality, but it also explains why the archaeological search became so passionate. People did not dig at Hisarlik only to understand a settlement. They dug because Troy had become a symbol of whether the oldest stories of civilization could touch real Earth. The story also survives because ruins themselves are persuasive. A city that disappears entirely may become too abstract. Troy leaves a mound. Mycenae leaves walls. The landscape gives memory a body. Even when people misunderstand the layers, even when they attach the wrong treasure to the wrong king, the material presence of the ruins keeps the story from floating away. Standing before ancient stones, people feel that something happened there, even if they cannot say exactly what. Archaeology later disciplines that feeling, corrects it, complicates it, and sometimes disappoints it. But the first emotional power remains: the world of the story was not entirely invented. It left stone in the ground. Modern audiences keep returning to Troy for another reason. It offers the drama of mystery without requiring the abandonment of reason. The story contains enough evidence to feel historically anchored and enough uncertainty to remain open. It invites questions that cannot be answered too easily. Was there one war or many? Was Helen a memory of diplomacy, a goddess diminished into a queen, or a poetic cause for political conflict? Did Troy fall to Mycenaean attackers, local enemies? Internal betrayal, natural disaster, or a convergence of pressures? How much of the song preserves Bronze Age reality, and how much belongs to later imagination? Scholars still debate these issues, and that debate keeps the story alive not as a solved puzzle, but as a living encounter between disciplines. At its deepest level, Troy survives because it speaks to the fear that every civilization carries quietly inside itself. Walls can be built, alliances can be sworn, wealth can be stored, names can be praised, but cities still fall. The people of Troy, as remembered in legend, do not lack courage. They do not lack love for their home. They do not lack defenders. Yet the city burns. The Greeks, for their part, do not escape the cost of what they have done. Their glory is shadowed by loss. This double tragedy gives the story a gravity that simple heroic adventure could never sustain. It suggests that history is not a clean ascent of winners, but a field of ruins where victory and grief often stand together. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War may therefore lie partly in its legacy. The war survives not because it gives one perfect answer, but because it preserves the feeling of a world at the edge. It remembers the Bronze Age through the language of human conflict. It turns geopolitical pressure into family crisis, collapse into fire, and the passage of time into song. The story endures because it is both ancient and unfinished. Every generation approaches Troy and finds something different. A lost city, a warning, an origin, a tragedy, a puzzle, a mirror. The walls have fallen, but the memory still stands. And perhaps that is the most mysterious survival of all. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War is not a single buried object waiting in the earth. Not one tablet still sealed in clay, not one inscription that will suddenly make every poem factual and every doubt disappear. It is a layered truth, built from ruins, fragments, old songs, damaged archives, and the stubborn human need to remember disaster in a form that can be carried forward. Troy stands at the centre of that truth because it belongs to more than one world at once. It is a real archaeological site, a Bronze Age settlement, a strategic city near a dangerous crossing, a possible Wilusa in the records of an Anatolian empire, a burning city in Greek epic, a lost homeland in Roman imagination, and a symbol that later civilizations keep remaking in their own image. The closer the story is examined, the less it resembles the simple version often inherited from childhood. A beautiful queen is taken, 1,000 ships sail, heroes fight for 10 years, a wooden horse enters the city, and Troy burns. That version survives because it is clear, memorable, and powerful. But beneath it lies a world that is less tidy and more believable. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is a system of palace economies, trade routes, diplomatic obligations, military rivalries, and fragile prestige. Mycenaean rulers across the Aegean are ambitious, wealthy, competitive, and capable of organised violence. Western Anatolia is not a blank stage, but a contested frontier watched by the Hittite Empire and influenced by maritime powers. Troy's location near the Dardanelles gives it practical importance. The city may have stood at the meeting point of roots, loyalties, and fears. If war came to Troy, it may have come for reasons the poets later transformed. A marriage scandal may preserve a memory of broken diplomacy. Helen may stand for the political value of royal women, for violated alliance, for desire turned into public crisis, or for the human face given to causes too complex to sing. The Oath of the Suitors may preserve the logic of coalition warfare, where rulers join a campaign not from pure loyalty, but from obligation, pressure, ambition, and the hope of reward. The 10-year siege may preserve the feeling of prolonged struggle rather than an exact calendar. The wooden horse may preserve a memory of deception, siegecraft, earthquake damage, ritual misunderstanding, or simply the need for a strong city to fall in a way worthy of memory. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, and that is why the story remains alive. Archaeology narrows the mystery without closing it. It shows that Troy was real, that it was occupied for centuries, that its walls were formidable, that its people lived in a region of deep strategic importance, and that late Bronze Age levels suffered destruction. It suggests stress, rebuilding, violence, and catastrophe. But archaeology does not name Achilles. It does not identify Hector's house. It does not place Helen on a ship or reveal a wooden horse buried in ash. It gives material truth, not poetic certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and its incompleteness must be respected. To force the ruins to match the poem exactly is to damage the truth in a different way, just as early excavators damaged the mound in their rush toward Homer. The Hittite records add another kind of light. Wilusa and Ahiyawa may not be simple equivalents of Ilios and Achaia, but their presence in the archives makes the geopolitical setting of the Trojan story far more plausible. They show that Western Anatolia mattered, that Aegean powers could interfere there, that local rulers navigated a dangerous world of treaties and pressure, and that a city in Troy's region could become entangled in the politics of empires and seaborne rivals. These records do not tell the epic. They reveal the kind of world from which an epic memory could grow. In their dry diplomatic language, they make the song less impossible. The wider collapse of the late Bronze Age gives the war its darkest background. Around the same broad era, palaces fall, trade weakens, cities burn, populations move, and old systems lose their coherence. If Troy's destruction belongs to this period, then its fall may have been one event inside a much larger unravelling. That does not make the city unimportant. It makes it more important. Troy may have survived in memory precisely because it turned a scattered age of crisis into one unforgettable image, a city at the edge of the sea, defended for years, betrayed by a final trick, and consumed by fire while an entire heroic world begins to vanish with it. The war becomes a vessel for remembering not only conflict, but the end of the civilization's confidence. The hidden truth, then, is partly that myth and history are not enemies here. They are different forms of survival. History asks what can be proven, dated, compared, and reconstructed. Myth asks what a catastrophe meant to those who inherited its memory. The Trojan War lives in the space between them. Strip away all poetry, and something human is lost. Accept all poetry as literal fact, and the past becomes fantasy. The harder task is to listen to both the stones and the song, allowing each to correct the other. The stones say Troy was real, complex, strategic, and destroyed. The song says its fall mattered so deeply that people refused to let it die. This layered truth may be less satisfying than a simple revelation, but it is more faithful to the ancient world. Real wars rarely begin from one cause. Real cities rarely fall for one reason. Real memories rarely preserve events without changing them. Troy may have been attacked by Mycenaean forces, or by a coalition later magnified into one grand expedition. It may have suffered through siege, raid, internal betrayal, earthquake damage, famine, or the chaos of a collapsing regional order. It may have been one of several conflicts fused into a single epic war. What can be said with confidence is that the legend grew from soil rich enough to sustain it. It did not bloom over nothing. And so the final image is not of an answer, but of a convergence. On one side are the walls of a Bronze Age city, overlooking a landscape of shifting coasts, rivers, winds, and sea lanes. On another side are Mycenaean palaces, their storerooms counted by scribes, their kings hungry for wealth and honour. Farther inland are Hittite archives, recording treaties and troubles along a restless frontier. Around all of them is the late Bronze Age world, dazzling with connection and already beginning to crack. Above them is the long voice of oral tradition, turning fear, pride, grief, and destruction into poetry. Somewhere inside that convergence, the Trojan War becomes more than legend and less than certainty. That may be the most honest hidden truth of all. Troy was not only a place where a city may have fallen, it was a place where history passed into memory, and memory passed into myth, and myth led modern hands back into the earth. The war remains unresolved because it belongs to all three realms at once. It is ash in the ground, politics in the archives, and fire in the imagination. The city was destroyed, rebuilt, misremembered, excavated, argued over, and reborn in every age that tries to understand it. The truth behind the Trojan War is hidden not because it is absent, but because it is buried in layers, and each layer is real in its own way. The wind settles over the plain where Troy once stood, and the story begins to loosen its grip. The burned city fades back into stone. The ships become shapes on a distant waterline. The bronze weapons lose their shine. The voices of kings, warriors, scribes, singers, and excavators grow softer, until only the landscape remains a mound under the sky, a passage of water nearby, and the long patience of earth covering what human beings could not keep. Troy endures because it belongs to the deep rhythm of memory. Civilizations build walls and believe those walls will hold. They store grain, gather wealth, make treaties, launch ships, and speak proudly of names that seem too important to vanish. Yet time moves through every gate. Rivers shift, harbours silt, palaces burn, languages disappear from daily speech, songs change shape as they pass from one generation to another. What was once urgent becomes uncertain. What was once a city becomes a question. And still, Something remains. Not everything. Never everything. But enough. A line of wall, a broken jar, a burned floor, a name in a foreign archive, a poem shaped by centuries of remembering. The hidden truth behind the Trojan War is not only about whether one famous siege happened exactly as later poets described, it is also about how human beings carry the memory of loss. They turn ruin into story because silence alone is too heavy. They give names to the dead because ash has no voice of its own. They imagine the fall of a city so that the city does not fall completely. There is a strange comfort in that. Troy was destroyed, but it did not disappear. Its people are gone, its kings cannot answer, its streets have been buried and disturbed and argued over, yet the place still asks to be understood. The war remains suspended between fact and legend. But perhaps that is why it feels so close. Human memory often lives there, in the space between what can be proven and what cannot be forgotten. As evening gathers over the old mound, the great questions do not need to be forced into final answers. The stones keep their silence. The sea keeps moving through the straits. Somewhere beneath the grass lie the traces of fear, ambition, endurance, and fire. Above them, the story continues to drift through time, no longer as a shout of battle, but as a low, fading echo from a world that once believed its walls would last forever.